The fourth day of the conference is very targeted sessions for administrators, CTOs, IT directors, IT staff. So all of the content on that fourth day will be very much designed on that. 3 days have the coaches, administrators, etc. Before and you're interested, ask question or answer questions. Check it out on our website as well.
Will we get a copious note?
Copy she gets
Great. Certainly then follow up you via email. We have information out. We're working on today. Any other questions? All right, then over to jump.
Executive Director for Safe Board of Education. I know out there that look familiar at some point. Just kind of give state board, and then we're at with e-learning today. What I'm going to talk about, and then we'll get into the presentation. So, as Executive Director for Safe Education, I oversee our department for nutrition programming, alternative programming. And so, newly established department of as well. Okay, we're talking about today was for some time. So not sure where for right now is the department for. So today about the statutory requirements. So I'm just going to go through the nuts and the bolts of what the law is. Feel free to raise your hand, ask a question. Hey, that's not what I thought. That doesn't look right. You know, those types of things. Let's talk about those issues. Then I'm going to take you to our web resources right now, and thinking about how we can use those resources to help you in the field, how you can help us develop some more robust guidance, right? As you move into e-learning programming or start thinking about those in your school district. So before I even get too far, anyone have an e-learning program that they've brought to their board thus far? Are you the same district? Or different districts? Two. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to be coming back to you guys as we talk a little bit more this morning. Okay. So how did we get to where we're at today? Anybody remember the ISBE roadshows last year? Anyone participate or attend one of our roadshows? Yes, where we basically went out and said, hey, the law has changed. There's a requirement for clock hours, structure of 5 hours for each day. The law in EDF, when our new funding formula was passed, eliminated the minimum clock hour, but also eliminated the requirement that any clock hours of a mortar school facility, right? And so what we had done last year was go out and talk to, I think we had about 11 different areas of the state that we went to and talked about some of the flexibility that was afforded in law last year in the absence of some of that statute. If I want to say oversight, funding formula. So after all of that, after ISBE going out and saying there's some flexibility, start thinking about this, some districts actually employed some e-learning last year. A law was passed in the spring that was effective July 1 that brought us back to where we were prior to last year, where 5 hours is now the minimum, again, instructional time requirement for a valid or for a legal school day. And also those 5 hours have to be within a brick and mortar school facility, just like it was before. However, there was some additional flexibility to counterbalance some of the advocates that wanted to see more flexibility. Those 5 hours in 101 Public Act 101-12 include things like, dual credit or site-based learning, vocational programming, and so forth, but also provided for an expansion of e-learning, okay, or the utilization of e-learning statewide. Previous to Public Act 101-12, we had a e-learning pilot program where a whopping 3 school districts across the state were able to apply to the state superintendent of education and conduct e-learning programs. Okay. So one of the things that the kind of advocates on the flexibility side asked in this law was to, okay, we'll bring it to 5 hours back. However, can we expand e-learning so that any district can participate as they see fit? And where we're at today. Those 3 school districts were Gurnee, Leiden, and West Chicago. I don't know if anyone's seen any of their information. I'm going to be referring to those 3 districts after the PowerPoint when I show some resources. We have some of their reports, some of their some of the positive things they found when they engaged in e-learning, some of the barriers that they've experienced, and some of the ways that they overcame some of those barriers as well. So it's one of those things where we think connecting you with districts that have been there before was probably more useful than us talking at you saying this is how it should be done. So we want to make sure this is more of a community-based learning experience. Any questions before I go ahead and talk about the law specifically? Okay, so when I say the law, I'm referring to Public Act 101-12, effective July 1, allows any school district, does not require, allows school districts to create and implement a program of e-learning, electronic learning that must be research-based, and those e-learning days can be used in lieu of scheduled emergency days. So the idea here is not that you can schedule out e-learning days once a week, once a month, just ad hoc or even ad hoc. It would be used instead of snow days, right? So instead of days typically that you would just have to make up from an emergency day. So the number of e-learning days, consequently, when you look at your school calendar, okay, cannot exceed the number of emergency days that the school district has included in their calendar. Now, the vast majority of school districts include 5 emergency days, right? The school calendars doesn't have to be 5, it could be more, right? But the idea prior to e-learning, or even now, is you have to make up your emergency days. But after you're done with your emergency days, you go into act of God days. Those do not have to be made up. So most districts keep that about 5, so that on the 6th day, there's no requirement to make up that day. And obviously, the whole idea of electronic is to allow for instruction to occur while students are not physically present at a centralized location. The law talks about various ways of defining the E part of e-learning. So it's not just internet, but it could be the internet. The law specifically mentions telephone instruction, text, chat rooms, or any other similar means of electronic communication. Okay, so thinking more broadly about what E means, especially now with apps, different programming, could be a number of different options that best meets the needs of your community, your students, and your staff, by the way. I know we think and we should think centrally about students, but making sure that staff and parents, community have access to whatever E means in your particular school district. Okay. All teachers and staff who may be involved have to have access to hardware and software that may be required for the program. And if a proposed program does not address this responsibility, the school district must propose an alternate program. So what the law is saying is, if your staff and your students don't have access to a particular function of your e-learning program or whatever you're using for electronic communications, electronic instructions, an alternate program should and must be used. So what does the law say about what has to be included in an e-learning plan? First, it does have to be 5 hours of instruction. Okay, so just like if you were in a traditional classroom environment, 5 clock hours of instruction is required during the e-learning day. We're talking a little bit about how college districts accounted for those 5 hours. So it's the question, right? Students at home, how do I know that they're actually engaged? How do I tell that my teachers are actually engaged in instruction for 5 hours? That's done in a number of ways and done very creatively depending on the district that you're looking at. Obviously, ensure access from home or other appropriate remote facilities for all students that are participating. Very easy for one-to-one districts, right? Not every district is one-to-one. And so thinking about this more, I guess, broadly, when not every student one of the things we talk about law, I'm using the language from the law here, access from home or an appropriate remote facility. If you're using an e-learning day because of severe weather, it's not reasonable to ask a student to travel to the library, right? For safety reasons, obviously, to access a computer, as an example, or the internet for that matter. So just kind of starting to think about these things. And a lot of these issues, again, we can refer back to the 3 pilot districts, how they handle this, but also a deep discussion with your community, your parents, your administrators, and your teachers, and so forth, to see what best might meet the needs for your program. Ensure that non-electronic materials are made available for students participating in the program who do not have access to required technology. This is a wrinkle in the law that we're trying to figure out right now through guidance. So if I can take you back one screen, it says, ensure access from home or other appropriate remote facilities for all students. But then the next piece of the law says, well, if they don't have access, make sure there's non-electronic materials made available, right? So there seems to be an inconsistency there in the law. And so we're grappling with that via non-regulatory guidance about how we would move forward. The idea here, in talking to some of the districts who are really, really excited about e-learning, say, we want to make sure this works. We want to do this with fidelity so that the General Assembly doesn't, quote unquote, take it away. The easiest way for e-learning, if you're interested to be taken away from the legislature, is if we just see take-home packets being sent home with students, right? And not real engagement, not real instruction. Now, I'm not saying packets are a bad thing in and of themselves, but if that suffices, if that takes the place of actual instructional activity, that could be an issue. So that's one of the issues we're grappling with right now. What does that mean? Might even be something we look at in the spring for legislative cleanup, right? And not even weighing in one way or the other, but just trying to address the inconsistency in that particular statute. Any questions so far? The e-learning program has to ensure appropriate learning opportunities for students with special needs. So when we say all students, we do mean all students, students with IEPs, potentially 504s, depending, obviously meeting their needs, but if, if the 504 needs have to be met in school, that could be an issue as well. English learners, right? Making sure that they have appropriate access. So when we say special needs, we're not just talking about students with IEPs, but students across the board. Some of the pilot districts and districts thinking about e-learning right now, at least for students with IEPs, they're just building this into students' IEPs right now, right? So what would happen during an e-learning day to make sure that they're actually comporting not just with the law, right, but the individual needs of the students through the IEP. Yes, sir.
We're currently heavily investigating e-learning days this year. And one of the big unknowns how to handle, besides like kind of K1 straight up, because that kind of seems like it's packets or go outside and count the snowflakes in your yard or something, right? But
it's math,
the related services, all like the social worker sites and stuff like that, that ideally you're spending time with the kids that day, so then it becomes what does a site and social worker or blah, blah, blah do on an e-learning day? And do they assign work somehow, even though they don't have a class roster in SIS? And so a lot of it's going to kind of probably dovetail into some type of an assignment / worksheet kind of thing, but I know the state's not really big on a go packet kind of a thing of work to do on a worksheet.
And I don't want to say we're not, I don't want to weigh in formally on a position. I just know, knowing the bill's sponsors and what they were concerned about originally was they just don't want take-home packets and count that as a day because that's homework, that's not instruction, right? So your point stands. If I could say this, and we'll get to it maybe in a little bit when we look at the pilot districts. I know one of the districts, they just made sure that, and it sounds easier than actually implementing, they made sure their counselors, psychologists, social workers were all available via phone or via chat for students that would have gotten minutes during that particular day. Again, it's more complicated than that, but it's a question. Yes.
And the phone issue, when your staff is at home, someone asked about the legalities of their personal phones and communicating with families, because I do have teachers who will not text with parents on their phones because that phone can be subpoenaed in the future. So they will not, so they're saying, I'm not going to communicate with a parent on something that does not belong to the school district. And so we went to chat room, Google Chat with the parents, but that was a legal.
That's a great point. That's not anything we've contemplated at the state as of yet. You're right. And that's why we always caution our employees at the agency not to use their personal devices, because during a FOIA or an investigation, that becomes the OIEG property or whatever. Yes, and we'll talk in a second. We'll talk in a second about how these programs, however, you have to have not just a buy-in and commitment from, but the sign-off of all of your collective bargaining units as well. Yeah. So that's one way of negotiating through that, but that's a very, very good point to be addressed. Sir?
We're looking into the possibilities of the learning as well. And internally, use Remind to kind of offset that problem. But we also have Jabber, so depending on your network structure, it allows, the idea is it's going to allow counselors, anybody outside of a teaching role that may interact with students and parents to make a call from their district device, and it can mimic the extension of the district.
There was also talk, someone very nitpicky about, well, that's my internet at home. You want me to do school hours work on my person?
If they're using a work device.
Yeah. I can't even get my school district to help pay for my cell phone, so, but I was
ask them about Cyber Monday at work.
Right. It came up yesterday when a teacher, I went, oh, remind me that on an e-learning day. Kids are everywhere. They're at daycare centers. They're at a lot of different places. They don't have access to.
So your point is probably the central most important one in discussions of e-learning, which is this appropriate for our district and for our community? Maybe the answer is no. Maybe the answer is yes within context. I mean, there could be a real possibility that if you employ an e-learning program and a child does not have, I don't want to say the ability to log on, but for whatever reason doesn't log on, or you can't track it, they'll be absent for that day. I can't imagine a scenario where you would want to mark a student, not you, your district, mark someone absent, or the state indicate someone is absent because they didn't have access to technology. This is broader than just the school community. It's the entire community where this, where the student is going to be. And so these are deep discussions that have to be had. Is this right? Especially, I think someone mentioned K1, the young kiddos. Does this work for elementary districts? Maybe it works at the, the middle school level. Could you have separate calendars for the young kids and the older kids? No. So, it's something that, and again, I don't want to come before you and say we don't have all the answers, but we don't have all the answers. This is something that really needs to be thought out locally. Is this best for the needs of your kids? And I appreciate you bringing that back to the kids, right? Essentially, what we're trying to make sure is students don't miss learning, right? Not just so that adults don't have to make up days later on. It's a benefit. That's not the central focus of what this is supposed to be about. So ensure appropriate opportunities for students with special needs. Monitor and verify each student's electronic participation, depending on the program. The electronic the technology that you're using, that can be done in a number of ways. We'll talk a little bit later about how some of the pilot districts did everything on a particular app, so they can actually see when a student's logged in. The teacher is actually transmitting information back and forth. One of the districts had the teachers check in with their students every hour or every 2 hours to see where they're at and talk to the students. Now, in a small class, that's great. In a larger class, that's a little bit more difficult. So just thinking about those types of things. Address the extent to which student participation is within the student's control as to the time, pace, and means of learning. So what does this mean? In a nutshell, whatever technology you choose, and they say the student, we're talking about all students, student participation, is that meeting the needs of each individual child, right? In terms of the method, how fast you're going, the means of learning. And a lot of this, I'll be honest with you, you might find out is not working after you implement, right? And so that's a little bit difficult too. I mean, planning for this is great and everything looks great. It's research-based. You've done you've looked at comparable districts that have done similar things. So what we'll see is one of the components of this as well is kind of a continuous reevaluation, right, of the program to make sure that it's doing what it's intended to do. Let's provide effective notice to students and their parents or guardians of the use of particular days for e-learning. So when am I going to find out, if I'm a parent, right, that we have an e-learning day tomorrow? Is it first thing in the morning? Is it the night before? I will say one of the pilot districts said, you know what, if you have not heard from us by 9 o'clock the night before, we're either going to cancel school or we're going to have a normal school day, right? That's just what they had set in stone to make sure there was no ambiguity. This was it, right? I think another one said the same thing, but it was like 6 o'clock the next morning, right? So it just depends on the size of your community, the capability for you to push messages out, right? The access that your families have to immediate communications via email, text, whatever you have employed, robocalls within the district, right? So how are you going to notify parents and guardians and staff for that matter, right, of e-learning days? Again, there's no particular requirement of what that has to look like. It just has to be baked into the plan. Provide staff and students with adequate training for e-learning days. So not just employing and handing the plan to a parent in a student handbook or to all your staff members, but actually training students and staff on how to use this, whatever technology program you're using. Ensure that all teachers and staff who may be involved in the provisions of e-learning have access to any of the hardware. I think we already talked about that. So again, making sure students and staff not only just have training, but actually have the requisite technology. I'm not sure how that ended up in your choice. Here's a big one. And I'm going to read it verbatim because it's important. I hate to read to adults, I'm sorry, but I'm going to do it. Ensure an opportunity for any collective bargaining negotiations with representatives of the school district's employees that would be legally required, and including all classifications of school district employees who are represented by collective bargaining agreements and who would be affected in the event of an e-learning day. So obviously, this requires negotiation with their teachers' unions. It would also require negotiations with any other union that you have. Paraprofessional union, student services union, lunchroom personnel, whoever is collectively union or collectively classified would have to be at the table here. I'm not an attorney, I'm not a labor attorney, right? But in looking at the language of the law, this certainly or most certainly would constitute a change in working conditions, which would automatically make it, something required to be bargained. Right, so this piece was intentionally inserted into this particular statute above and beyond the pilot districts to make sure that whatever plan comes through and is actually formally approved has been not just reviewed but signed off on technically by any unions and the employees of the school district as well. I mentioned this a few minutes ago. The plan has to have a mechanism, and again, it doesn't say how this has to happen, but that has to occur, to review and revise the program after it's been implemented, just to make sure that we're overcoming barriers, solving issues that we're seeing in implementation, and so forth. Ensure that the protocol regarding general expectations and responsibilities of the program is communicated to everyone 30 days prior to utilizing the e-learning day. So think about what that means. You have a requirement in the plan to train your staff and your students, right, on e-learning. We talked about that a slide or two ago. We also have a requirement here that those specific expectations of when we're going to be using e-learning, how we're going to be using it, and so forth, is communicated at least 30 days prior to using an e-learning day. So that if you pass an e-learning day on a Monday, right, you train everyone on a Tuesday, you still can't use, right, an e-learning day on a Wednesday, right? There has to be a 30-day buffer so that folks are either, continuously to train, review the documentation, and that it's not kind of a quick turnaround over for an e-learning day. So there's about a 30-day period baked into there once the plan is actually formally approved. Any questions on the specifics of the law? Those are the components that are required to be in the law. I'm just going to touch very
30
briefly.
work days, calendar days.
It's 30 days, so calendar days. And I learned this a long time ago, and I like to spread this. Unless it says 30 school days in the school code, it means 30 calendar days. At least that's what they tell me. All right, so how is all this accomplished? Let's say you have your plan. You've gone through negotiations with your union. You've done your research. It's a research-based program. It has to be a public hearing. And ultimately, the board is going to, your local board will have to adopt this, so it's not an administrative action by your district superintendent or other administration. This is a formal, it's a program that must be formally adopted by the school board. So a public hearing has to take place. Okay? Now, this could be a special board meeting, during a special board meeting, could be during a regular board meeting, right? So it doesn't have to be separate apart from a regular board meeting. It could be an agenda item on a fixed board meeting day. In 10 days prior, 10 calendar days prior to the hearing, notice of this hearing and the reasons for the hearing, which is the adoption of the e-learning program, has to be published in the newspaper, the general circulation within your district. Written or electronic notice designed to reach all parents, guardians of students. So publication in the newspaper, however you would either through literal U.S. mail or email or electronic notification to parents. And then all of your unions as well, written or electronic. We're going to start seeing a lot more of this language in the school code throughout, written or electronic, because written typically now means via email, something more electronic, so we're seeing that together now. So at least 10 days prior to that meeting, newspaper, parents, and your unions. The board will review, hear public comment, if any. So I think this is just a public hearing, so it's part of your board meeting. Missing a T by unit, excuse me. And after that, if the board decides to proceed with the e-learning program, the regional superintendent of schools is charged with verifying that the components in the plan meet the criteria of the law. Now, we've told ROEs that looking at the language of the law, we feel the intent of the law is to make sure that the components are met, not that they are going to be nitpicking whether or not they agree with what the district has put in, right? But just making sure that each component of the law has been specific. So what I'm going to do now, and I have to admit, and especially in front of a group of folks who are technologically savvy, I have to admit that ISBE's website is not so good. Okay, and I was gonna bring you right to a link and so forth. And so, what I want to show you right now is some information that we have currently online about e-learning, and this will be expanded as well. Okay, this has some resources. The reason I kind of gave that quip about our website is we no longer have pages like isbe.net/elearning, right? It's something like isbe.net/pages/this, and so the easiest thing to do is to go to Google, type in ISBE e-learning. It's going to take you right to where it is. It's embarrassing, but I'm being transparent with you, okay? And so that'll bring you to this. This is the actual first link that you'll see up if you go to Google ISBE e-learning. So a couple of things here. It has a link to the law, if you're interested in actually reading it. But then a couple of resources here I think are really, really helpful. So the e-learning pilot program that is now over, right, for the 3 districts, Gurnee, Leiden, and West Chicago, we were required to promulgate a report to the General Assembly by the end of May, okay, that just talked about the 3 districts, what they experienced vis-a-vis what the requirements of the e-learning program were at the time, and some of their experiences. And so if you bring this up, and I'm certainly not going to read the whole thing to you, but I want to show you how this is set up. I think this is a really great resource for you as you move forward. We have a couple cover pages, some general findings, but I think what is most helpful is this chart that we have here. So just very quickly, what e-learning days were used for each district? Excuse me. As you can see, only a couple of e-learning days were actually employed by these districts at that time. What was provided as evidence that a minimum of 5 clock hours of instruction were provided. So in West Chicago, and you can look in the detailed reports to see a little bit more information, but as a summary, login and submission times for each activity were tracked in logs. Leiden, they were required to go through a Google form and submit stuff. What did the district do to access from home or other appropriate remote facilities for students participating? So what we have here is a map of what the requirements are and what these individual districts, in a very summarized form, right, did to address some of these things. So the first thing I would do, if you're interested in bringing this back to your district, or if you're actually looking at e-learning right now or implemented, take a look at this. What did I lose? Okay, so I can show you how great we can ISBE. See how easy it was for Google? Okay. We also have a one-pager here that was released. This is more of a communications document, but might be nice for your communities as you are exploring this. Just talks about what e-learning is, what it isn't, what some of the exemptions, what some of the allowances are, and so forth, but it might be a helpful document as we move forward. A case study of the e-learning pilot districts. So where we had that summary report that went to the General Assembly, right here we have, and they're separated into different documents, a case study for each of the 3 districts, what they did, which includes their actual approved e-learning programs as well. So a lot of the text here, but then if you look to the side, key resources, Leiden's top 10 tips for planning implementation of e-learning, and then the individual reports from these districts as well as some other resources outside of our website as well. Finally, in June, we had a webinar with these 3 districts, knowing that this bill was going to be effective July 1. So they gave a presentation, each of the 3 districts, and answered questions from district administrators and some teachers as well that participated in the webinar. They were able to ask questions. The presentation is here, but a copy of the actual recording of the webinar is also available if you want to view that as well. Like I said, I think our approach has been learning from districts that have been there already. Is most appropriate. Doesn't mean we're not going to be promulgating additional guidance. In fact, we are going to be coming out with some guidance very shortly. But what we're trying to do right now is actually receive questions for that guidance. And so what we didn't want to do was tell districts, well, you're going to have to wait 6, 7, 8, 10 more months before we promulgate guidance before you can move forward. Get into the program. Just make sure you're meeting statutory requirements. As you're having questions around implementation, let us know. Contact us. We'll make sure your question is included in upcoming guidance that will be posted to this website as well. Yes, of course. This pilot was 3 districts for 3 years, correct? Yeah.
And out of that, was 4 days? 2 for one for each of them?
Yes. 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 Now, I will say there's a couple of reasons for only a couple of those days being used. One, you see that 3 out of the 4 were in 2018. I think the first year and a half was really done about research, and this was very new and no one had ever done it, at least in Illinois before, right? And that was, I think, all you saw some of that. So again, not to say that there's, a plethora of information out there, but we will be, like I said, putting some more guidance out there. What I would ask is if you have questions after today about implementation, about what the law says, about anything else about e-learning, send me a quick note at this email address right here, and you'll have this. We're going to send this email to you, so if you don't write it down, that's fine. What most likely we'll be able to do is answer your question right off, but then add that to our list of FAQs or guidance, right, that we're collecting statewide. Chances are if you're asking a question, somebody else as well. I don't have a timeline for when that guidance is coming out, other than it needs to be ASAP, but we simply don't have enough questions right now to get it out. So that's why our plea is just to let us know what you're having issues with as you're planning, as you're implementing, as you're struggling with this, and we'll make sure we have that. Any questions? Comments?
Is there? Oh,
No, go ahead. Okay.
is this something actually that you're actually thinking? Like, where do you see it? Is this something that you expect to be happening more of, and maybe to even go further than just the emergency days, or what is is there like a roadmap to this or expectation?
So I can't say there's an official position either from ISBE or certainly the General Assembly, but I can tell you anecdotally, it certainly looks like this is the first step to broadening this out more than just emergency days. Thinking about some of the negotiations that were had during session in the spring, there were some folks that just wanted e-learning days whenever, maybe a cap, but once a month or whatever it is. Those that didn't want any, and I think they landed on, well, let's just start here, right, where the pilot districts were. And if we see some success, and we don't see students being unfairly discriminated against and isolated from the school environment for this, maybe we can start thinking about implementing it a little bit further. That hasn't been said on the record, but that's absolutely what the discussions have been thus far. But again, we need to make sure that this is a success. We certainly know that there's a possibility, if not no fidelity, that this could expand the divide between students with and without resources, right? So not the intent here, but certainly a potential outcome if we're not careful about it. Sir? Yeah.
Because it just seems like a lot to do personally. Like, I don't know about everybody else, but for my district, there's just so many variables. To do all of this for a potential 5 days of snow days just seems like a whole lot of work.
So, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, it's a good point. It's one thing if you're doing all this work for monthly, even every other month, quarterly, whatever it is, but you're understood. Yeah, understood. Baby steps. Other final questions? Well, can I just say I've done present? Oh, yes.
Sorry, I just had.
Please.
One thing that we tried to do some of the e-learning days last year in that of opportunity. And one thing that I think that we really keep focusing on is, and again, we've developed our entire plan, but I think monitoring student attendance and tracking that is probably obviously the biggest thing, and what you can call within reason when it comes to students. And so what were some of the other districts doing when it came to student attendance? Because I know, like, I come from Indiana, where we had e-learning days, and we allowed within 3 days of when you missed school to turn in your homework, and then that counted for your attendance. And I know a couple of the districts said that they, I've heard where one marks everybody attendance, that they were there for that day automatically. Then they go back and say, if you didn't turn in an assignment, then you're counted as absent, which I think is a really good idea. And we've kind of started to put that together. Okay.
That's what our plan is. You're kind of your present until
proven otherwise. And so, I guess I kind of want to ask, because it's obviously within reason. What can we consider reasonable submitted work and all of that good stuff? And so, because Johnny could come to school and do nothing all day, but he's present. So when it comes to an e-learning day, if he turns in 2 or 3 assignments and maybe not for the rest of his classes, within reason, I would consider him still.
So let's say this too, and I don't know that the state board has any plans on promulgating formal rules around this, right? I think our thought is let districts get into this, and if we need to create rules to answer that question, we can do that. But if we do that, then we're telling districts explicitly how you have to count it. Right. Which is great for clarity, but not great for districts that want to do things a little bit differently than their neighbors, right? So I don't know where that's going to end long term, but I can say as of right now, we're not, is everyone here from Will County or is from Grundy Kendall as well? Whoever your original superintendent is, and they're all great. When they verify, we're not advising that they get into that level of, nope, I don't think you really verified this kiddo was there. We're certainly not going to do that. So those things about looking back after 24 hours, if that is how you are, if you're reasonably sure that they're there under your own program, you're going to mark them as in attendance, and you're just going to transmit that to us. Just like we're not in your schools right now saying, was JD, we're not doing that. But just as a quick summary, these 3 districts, right, had login. They use apps or some kind of programs where they can actually see the kids coming in to the actual platform and do that they were there. And that's fine.
We have the flexibility to say if they log in between today and tomorrow, because like we said, if kids are at daycare, grandma and grandpa's house, they don't have internet access. If I open it up like I did in my plan to have the computer lab open before school and after school, an hour each day following those days, to account for those students who don't have internet access.
That's tough because we're talking about the day of attendance being that particular day that's being used as the e-learning day. Right. So if you use the next day, that's going to be a little bit more thick because you need to account for the 5 hours on that particular day, not retroactively, right? Yeah, I understand. It makes sense what you're saying. Right. I understand that.
Because that's the flexibility of e-learning. That's the entire point of why we take online classes, because then I can do it at my own pace. And so that's where, when I saw that clause in there, it talked about reasonable, pace for that particular student, where does that come into play?
That would, and again, I agree philosophically with that. The problem is that requirement of still having 5 o'clock hours. If this wasn't there, I think what you're saying legally, comports. Yes.
One thing I would think with that is that's 5 o'clock hours. Does it have to be during the school day? Can it be 8 p.m. to 1 a.m.? Can it be 5 hours throughout the day?
No, it's just that particular day. Now, you might run into issues with parents, not with the state or, the statute, right? But no, I mean, within that particular day. Just like you could have extended day programming or after school, credit recovery, those types of things, I think would fit nicely. Yes, sir.
Did these 3 pilot districts do the 5 hours or not? And what's their reaction to the 5 hours? None of us back in the law.
Yeah, they did do the 5 hours during the pilot program. I don't want to speak for them, but I'll tell you my impression, which is we thought this was great on a limited basis. We need more flexibility to make this successful, right? And then you only saw 4 days, right? And so I think one of those things would be the 5-hour requirement, saying, look, if we've been talking about, and as you know, I mean, the field of education is moving away from seat time towards competency-based programming, right? And so this, having the 5 hours back kind of contradicts, right, where we're all trying to go, which is making sure kids are learning at their own pace, and but I think their reaction, I think it'd be safe to say, is yes, they had to do the 5 hours, but I think that was an impediment to expanding this even further for those particular districts.
One of the issues that hasn't been talked about is that with the 5 hours, you've got a meal plan in there somewhere. You got meal time, either a lunch or a dinner. That would.
Lunch isn't part of your 5 hour.
I know, but what I'm saying is there'd be a kid that take a break and have lunch, and the teacher is waiting. Okay, when you come back?
Yeah. So so even within the 5 hours, has to be flexible. You're right. I mean, things like even now, I mean, passing period, recess, lunch doesn't count for the 5 hours. But you're right. But in the e-learning, I think you could, since it's not a traditional school day per se, that are scheduled out periods like that, as long as you account for 5 hours, even if they're not consecutive, even if they're not blocked out, that absolutely works. Did someone? Yes, sir.
This is just my thinking, that we know about the whole online process. The whole thing is that it's not traditional. You know what I'm saying? It's just not traditional. So as long as you're getting the content, right, the instruction, and you're producing a product, even if it's not all 5 hours in one day, it just seems like the whole definition of idea behind e-learning is that it's happening. It doesn't have to happen in a traditional sense. So it's kind of like you're kind of keeping us in a hole, telling us to expand, but yet keeping us in this hole.
Yeah. I mean, it's a policy statement that you're making that I don't disagree with. Yeah. And I think, but again, and I, just to reiterate, just so that we're on the same page, there were 2 sides when this bill was being negotiated, really. Back to what it was prior in the last 30 or 40 years, back to where we were last year, which was the sky's the limit, do whatever you need to do, just make sure kids are learning competently. And this is kind of where they landed as a compromise. Point absolutely well taken, ma'am, and then I'll get to you, sir.
Okay, I kind of got 2 things, just kind of piggybacking off of what you're saying, and I just kind of thought in regards to the 5 clock hours for the Compulsory Attendance Act. So I'm thinking that that's the reason why they came up with that 5 clock hours, because they have to have a certain
absolutely,
amount of clock hours at the end of the school year in order for promotion and things of that nature. But my question is, what was the learning management platform that was the most common for the districts that did the pilot? What did they use?
I don't know if they used the same platform. Eric,
maybe not use the same platform. It might have been, were they using Google?
Yes.
Were they using
Somebody
Canvas? What was it that they used?
It was different. They were different. They were all different.
One moment, Eric goes a little bit.
Yeah, one was using Schoology, one was using Google Classroom. I don't remember what the third one was, but they're all different. No one's using the same ones.
But their plans are available here, and I'll make sure that we have the link series you can delve in, not just so you can see kind of what they did, but actually read the plan itself. I think that would be helpful. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not familiar with a lot of the platform, and so I apologize that I just don't have those ready for discussion. But I can certainly get that information, get it to the whole group here.
I think it's right in that.
It's in here, yeah. It is. I mean, Google was one of them. I just wanted.
Of course, the districts.
Yeah. I didn't want to. struggle finding that while
That
everyone's looking
video
at
was
me right
good.
now.
They
Sir.
just kind of talk about it.
I was just going to comment that
Yeah.
I had some conversations in terms of some of the concern over the 5 hours. They had students that did do 5 hours after school hours. What it was when they billed, or what they told their teachers to prepare for, the teachers pretty much stayed for their normal work hours where they were available. It wasn't necessarily structured, all 30 of you were in a Google Hangout together. And then when they built their lessons, it wasn't this hard-nosed tracking to 5 hours perfectly. It was the lesson plan built for a 5-hour day. Because you have your student, just like in a traditional classroom, that it's going to take them 5 minutes to do what you thought was going to take 30, but then you have another kid who takes 40 minutes to do what you thought was going to take 30. So, I mean, the 5 hours from the conversations I've had with the district, I wouldn't, this is strictly my opinion, I'm not speaking for anybody, but the idea is it's your planning for a 5-hour day, just like you normally plan for a 5-hour day in your school, and that's going to vary. So, I mean, I think if you get stuck on that 5-hour thing, you say like, I got to make sure that they're there, doing work for exactly 5 hours, it is going to be a ton of work, more than what it's worth for the emergency.
No, I appreciate that point, and I know you're not speaking for Grady, but no, I appreciate that point. But you're right, it's planning for the 5 hour. I mean, I think maybe not planning for the 5 hours, how you're saying, but the verification that the ROE is going to be doing is looking for the 5 hours. Now, and I think you made the point too. Who knows what kind of work a kid's doing when they're in the traditional school environment anyways, they're not doing any work. So I agree in principle. It's just whatever system you have is going to have to reflect that 5 hours instruction was maybe offered. Maybe that's even a better term. I mean, realistically, we know that you're not going to get 5, but hence is what the law says. Yes.
So do the hours change if you're half-day kindergarten versus full-day?
So there's allowances in statute for what constitutes a day of attendance for kindergartners. So
Okay.
I think it's as simple as 2.5 to 3 hours. I'm trying to think of what it is. I don't have that in front of me, but it would, whatever that equivalent like right now is for you to count that kid for a full time would be the same number of hours. For this. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's, I want to say 3. That doesn't, I know it's not quite half, but I think it's 3. I was going to say, usually, and I'm out talking about this throughout the state. I live literally right down the road in Frankfurt, so this was the best place to be this morning. So I appreciate everyone's time today. And again, please, you'll have my email address when I send the PowerPoint around, but it was on here. Please let me know if you have questions, concerns. Hey, that this is looking different than what you said. We can grapple with that. And if you have some success stories, would really love to hear those too, to help get that out throughout the state, to help some of your colleagues around kind of who are grappling with the same issues. So that would be welcome as well. Okay. Thank you all this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you. For those of you joining us online, we're just going to switch out speakers, so we'll be right back.
Thanks for coming out tonight. Today. I'm Eric Rucky. I'm a principal consultant in the curriculum office over at State Board of Education, mainly working with educational technologies, the programs that relate to ed tech. So I was a tech director not too far away from here, actually, for 13 years prior to coming to the state agency, and then also as a classroom teacher for 7 years prior to that. So basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're here, based on the era, but why we have this law. Why did this happen now as opposed to like some other time? And kind of diving into the text of the law does a bunch of things to it. So it defines some terms, and it sets out duties and prohibitions, so basically do's and not do's for 3 distinct groups of folks. So the operators of ed tech application sites, schools, you guys, and us. So I know there's been some talk in some circles about this law not applying to ISBE. Wrong, it applies to ISBE. Matter of fact, there's certain things that we're legislatively required to provide to you folks at some point between now and July of 2021. So we'll get into that too, but this law definitely applies to ISBE. So basically, all three groups are going to be subject to this. There's also some interesting things in this law about what it doesn't do. There's actually a section where it says this law does not do this. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then a couple of things that you can do as far as next steps to get kind of prepared to implement the law, as well as some other news and information stuff about things that we're going to do as the agency and some other partner groups like IDEA and the LTC is doing to help districts get ready for this. So with that, exactly how did we get here? So the ed tech and the data that it collects has just basically exploded. When I first started teaching, and this is back in the 1990s, back in the Stone Ages when we didn't have access to internet and ubiquitous stuff, and having a room with everyone having laptops was a rare thing back then. All of our data was on paper. We had these great, remember the old grade books, the grids and the spiral things, and now it's like spreadsheets and Google Drive and all that stuff. And it's a cool thing, and there's a lot of benefits to having that kind of data. I mean, you really can get a good grasp of exactly where our students are at, and then take that knowledge and then take that data and really personalize learning experiences for them. And this is all really good stuff, and there's a lot of research that says this is some really good things. So this graphic happens from the data quality campaign on just how rich, how much data is available to the teachers and what they can do with it to the benefit of the kids. This is all really good stuff and really powerful stuff. And back when I first started teaching 20-some years ago, we had this stuff, but it was a lot more difficult to handle because it was all on paper. It was all very analog. I had 140 kids one of those years, and trying to keep track of all that on paper, it was a little difficult. Nowadays, it's all on spreadsheets and reports, and I can press a button and the thing will analyze it for me real quick, and it's really cool stuff. But there's also kind of the other side of it too. So there's been a lot of news lately about data breaches and what big companies are doing with data, not necessarily in an ed tech form, but it kind of bleeds over to what we're doing. Sometimes there's been a lot of concerns about what companies like Facebook and Google are doing. I'm not want to turn this into a kick Facebook, but there's some questions as to companies that offer services for free. That's great, and hey, who doesn't like free, especially schools, right? Google Apps for Education. How many of you are Google Apps districts? Probably everybody, right? Microsoft 365. Okay, that just basically covered everybody. Cool stuff, and it's offered for free in most cases. Yes, there are some tiers that are paid, but for the most part, the core services for both platforms are provided free of charge. However, there always is a little bit of a price. So Google, Microsoft, other companies, they have all this data that we're giving them: student names, student profiles, their grades, their any sort of record about them. Well, what are they doing with this stuff? And then a lot of schools have been adopting personalized learning platforms. So another one that was really controversial, it still is. How many of you have heard of Summit Learning? A couple of you? Summit Learning is a learning management system and content provider that's funded by the Zuckerberg Foundation. Zuckerberg as Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. So what ended up happening with this one is that in order to help develop the platform and to get some engineering help, he had Facebook employees actually work on that. Well, okay, so the foundation and they're helping schools, but then you're having outside people working on a platform that has a lot of data, and that company is really interested in that data. So people found out about that and kind of freaked out a little bit. Like, wait a minute, what? And then make matters a little bit worse for that company, a couple of kids that were under this program had some issues with it, and then started doing dives on their end user license agreements. How many of you all read those things, right? Oh, RTFM, right? No, but they actually did, and interesting enough, at the time, Facebook got that data from the students and actually could hold on to that data past the graduation date of those students. And they're like, wait a minute, what? We didn't sign up for this, and why would they need this data after we graduate? So concerns there, that blew up in the news. There was some concerns about Class Dojo with a lot of disciplinary information. Class Dojo is kind of cool. You can track, when kids go to the bathroom and have bathroom breaks, and if they're being too loud or whatever. Yeah, it's a kind of a neat little tool, especially like little kids and stuff too. Elementary grades are really fond of it. But what exactly are they doing with that data? And especially if you match name with the data, of what's going on with your tracking, I don't know, that could be a problem. And there's also been a tremendous amount of news as of late about breaches and ransomware. It's pretty much throughout the news during the course of the week, besides all the other stuff that's going on. If you get past that part, you might actually hear about another breach or another attack or some hack that's been done or some company has just lost everyone's data. All this has been in the news, and it seems to be becoming more and more out there. And so parents are starting to question, like, hey, wait a minute, so school, what about my kids' data? How do we secure that? What exactly are you collecting and what are we doing with it? Why are we doing it? And how's it being secured? So this is a screenshot from a presentation that was done by a group out of Chicago called Raise Your Hand Action. They're a parent advocacy group. They did some sessions on student data privacy. And they were also one of the folks that were chiefly behind this law that we're talking about today. So these are things that their parent comments and stuff that are given to them about things that they're concerned about. And parents have a right to ask that. I'm not putting this up here to generate the group or to say I shouldn't have done that. They absolutely should have. And it's absolutely a good question to ask now, especially in light of all of the news out there about what's going on with data and security and practices and stuff. They're right to ask that. And we ought to be, as the tech administrators of our school districts, be attuned to this. But there's also some other concerns too. I mean, in general about screen time and a lot of time in front of screens. And okay, we can get into that too, but we're not. That's another tangent. But primarily, who has access to information and why are we collecting it and what are we doing with it? There's also been gigantic, huge news about ransomware attacks. The entire state of Louisiana was attacked, just about. And the attack was so bad, and this was right before school started. This is about late July, early August, that the governor of Louisiana, Governor John Bell Edwards, declared a state of emergency throughout the state. And that allowed him to bring in some pretty heavy state resources, including the state's National Guard, to assist districts with combating the cyber attack. So you have now the state giving daily briefings, including guys in full military uniforms, generals with stars on their shoulders, briefing people about the cyber attack. So really big deal. And that we're like, wait, what? The National Guard general is giving briefings to schools about what they need to do about cyber security and taking out their systems and stuff. So it's like, well, whoa, what? How did this happen? And why is this such, all of a sudden to the level of the governor, the adjutant general, the National Guard of Louisiana? It's some pretty, wow. So what exactly are we doing in schools with the technology again? So it's out there. And I don't know if this will play, but let's find out. Local media report. Of course, this worked this morning before I left. Okay, so maybe not. Rockford, right here, not too far away, experienced a cyberware attack a few months ago. They're still experiencing some issues and still trying to recover from it, even to this day. Thousands of computers had to have their hard drives pulled. We're talking thousands of hours of work probably, and the costs and stuff are, we don't really even know at this point, but I'm sure it's not inexpensive. Yes, they have insurance policies and they'll cover some of that, but there's going to be some expense incurred and something that we're planning for. So it even happens, very close to home. So really kind of two key questions about this whole issue I think are kind of important. And I don't know if some of you may have gone to the COSN session on cybersecurity that was sponsored a couple months back. And they had a person there by the name of Lynetta Ty, who has kind of done a lot of stuff in this realm, as a researcher, author. One of the key questions, her thing was, there's two questions that basically summarizes this entire issue. I think they're good to share with you. The first question basically, how can we assure our parents or students or stakeholders that the information that we're collecting, first off, we need it. Also, how are we managing it properly to secure it? And in accordance with all the legal rules and requirements and the community norms. So why are we collecting this data? What are we doing with it? And how are we securing it? Part of question number one. Second question, so as we're relying on all these different companies to handle this data, how can we assure those same groups of people, the parents, the students, community stakeholders, that the systems we're maintaining control over that data and that is being used properly by these tech providers? So we're giving this data to Google, we're giving this data to Schoology, we're giving this data to Remind or whoever. How do we know that they're only using that data for the legitimate purpose that we set out to get that app in the first place, and not taking the data, reselling it to third parties, or somehow otherwise monetizing that data, and that we still maintain control of that information in some way, shape, or form? That it doesn't just go there and then they can do whatever they want with it. It's kind of important because we're giving them a lot of data on students, and in some cases, you start that process in kindergarten. By the time the kid graduates 12th grade, that's what, 13 years of data? That's a gold mine. That is a huge amount of data on that kid. And in some cases nowadays, some of the kindergartens and some of the 12th graders, they would have had some kind of technology profile that goes all the way back, perhaps. So we're talking a massive amount of data here. All right, so, okay, we kind of have a little fun with this, but how hard it is to find comics about data? It's just something that's just not very, it's like lighten the mood, because this is kind of heavy stuff. So, so with all that, kind of just sort of setting the table of where we're at and how we got here, let's go, kind of talk about the act and the law. But yeah, this is probably a question we're going to start to be asking, is when we look at how to use the data, especially with, as we look into striving for different services and apps and stuff moving forward with this law. So it's kind of funny, but it also kind of hits a little close here too. But yes, there are cartoons that kind of poke fun at IT, data, and education. So, okay. So House Bill 3606, which is now Public Act 101-516, and also otherwise known as the Student Online Personal Protection Act of 2019. There was one prior. This one updates that. So this law was signed by Governor Pritzker on August 23rd. So this is now a law. So any previous things that we've done in the past, I know I did some session this summer, was still a bill that wasn't signed yet. So this is now a law. Disclaimer: I am not a lawyer. I'm like an educator like you guys. So this shouldn't be considered legal advice. I'm not qualified to give that. So
I should have said that too.
Yes. Jeff and I, none of the ISBE people in the room are lawyers, so just get that out of the way. We are not lawyers. We don't even play one on YouTube or any other streaming platform. But so none of the stuff that we're saying, myself or Jeff, should constitute any sort of legal advice. So if there's any specific legal questions, you should consult your own legal folks. But we'll do the best we can to answer any questions regarding this law as best we can. But again, with that caveat that not legal advice, we're not lawyers. So with that, what this law does, so it makes changes to the Student Online Personal Protection Act. There was one prior to this. A lot of the groups that wanted changes to this law and actually got this through felt that that law, while good intention, had too many loopholes that would allow other companies and firms and stuff to have too much control and kind of loopholes to get around restrictions. So part of the intent of passing this version was to tighten those things up. The law spells out terms and defines them. It also spells out specific things that 3 different groups of folks need to do. Like I said, for the operators of sites and services that market things to ed tech and to schools, public schools, and ISBE. Anybody from a private school here? Okay. Usually there's some parts of this that don't apply to private schools. Don't ask me why that's in there, it is. But everything I'm going to say here applies to all of us. We're all public school folks. Those of you online, if you're public schools, this also applies to you as well. This also grants parents and students specific rights over some of their data. Important point. They have some actually enumerated things they can do with this. So also, key thing, this is a law, yes. It doesn't go into effect until July 1st, 2021. So we have some time to implement this. 19 months or so. Sounds like a lot of time, but not really. So we're kind of busy trying to parse this out, kind of figure out what we need to do, hence these sessions, and there'll be a lot more coming down the pipe in the next 18 months on this. So let's get into some of the definitions. So what exactly does the law mean when it says a breach? Right, so breach is basically an unauthorized acquisition of computer data that compromises security, confidentiality, or integrity of covered information maintained by an operator or a school. So the breach can happen offside. If your provider ends up having some sort of data breach that has your data, it's a breach under this law. Or it could happen at the school if they breach your systems. Right? One exception is that it doesn't, there's also an exception which says it doesn't include the good faith acquisition of personal info by an employee. Not sure what that constitutes good faith acquisition of data, but that's in there. Just thought I'd mention it. But again, what does that mean? I'm not a lawyer. But definitely one thing to note though is that the breaches can happen two spots. Either you actually do have a breach in your own systems, physically located in your building, or by a provider. So those of you that use cloud applications, if there's a breach there, still a breach. Still have to deal with it because it's your data. You know it may have happened someplace else. So covered information. So what is it basically says that covered information is personally identifiable information. So what is PII? Well, it's a whole ton of things. I'm not going to read all that. But basically any piece of data that can cause me to like look at that and say, oh, okay, well, hey, I know that's Johnny or that's Cindy. Any piece of data set that I can then take and then combine with some other piece of data and find out, yes, I can identify specific people with that. That's PII. And it includes a lot of things, and some things are obvious, like their names. Oh yeah. But maybe some things that maybe not so obvious, like food purchases. Okay. Voice recording, geolocation info. I mean, we got cell phones. I can track your movements, right? That's part of it, perhaps. So there's all text, search activities, things like that. So there's a lot of things in here that, pieces of data that can be used and stuff that can identify somebody. So again, PII, personally identified information, is covered. And it's part of the definitions of that. So what is an operator? So basically an operator is any entity that is providing services with the knowledge that is basically being used in the K-12 application and marketed to schools. Right. So is that like in Google? Well, good. Some of the services are marketed, Google Ads for Education, but Google itself. What about Facebook? Some districts use Facebook to promote events and reach community members. Not exactly marketed to schools, but is it something that we do such as law? Would it fit this definition? And these are, I don't know. These are questions that have already been asked, and that's a good question. I'm not sure, but possibly. Again, something we'll have to consider. But the operator basically means anybody who is promoting a service to the schools for K-12 purposes. All right, so let's talk about the prohibition duties on the operators. All right, so these are the sites, the services, the apps that provide services to schools. So some of the things they can't do, right? So once this law becomes enacted, they can't engage in targeted advertising. It was based on any information that they glean through you giving them the data to make the app work. They can't use covered information. They can't use unique identifiers. They basically can't use it to sell ads. They can't amass a student profile unless it's part of the service, and it has to be for a K-12 school purpose. So amassing a profile to basically target lessons and customize lessons to the ability of the students, that could be okay. Using this to basically say, oh, well, this kid's also interested in sports. Let's market, hey, there's a sale on football here. No. Sell or rent information. So if you give them information, they can't sell it, they can't monetize it, they can't rent it out, they can't give it to third parties. They can't disclose it unless there's certain specific circumstances, but for the most part, no. Even the information they can't disclose to other people. Things they need to do. They need to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures and practices that meet or exceed industry standards. You'll see this a lot. There's basically 3 spots. This will apply to schools. This also applies to ISBE specifically. This is language right out of the bill. So what is it?
Is that NIST or
what's that?
Is that like NIST or?
Well, good question. I was going to say, what does that mean? Reasonable security procedures could be. If you're not familiar, NIST is the NIST cybersecurity framework. So National Institute of Standards and Technology. Basically, the federal government's cybersecurity guidelines are listed out in a document called the NIST guide, the NIST framework. That is a potential avenue that you could use to evaluate your own cybersecurity posture and adopt to harden it. It's not required in the bill. It's not part of this. It could be though, but they're not going to spell out exactly what that is. So, a good question. That's one of the things they don't define. What does that mean? What is a reasonable security procedure in practice? The data that's being given to these providers, it needs to be deleted within a reasonable amount of time period, unless the parents disallow it. So if the school requests the data be deleted, the provider needs to have some method by which that happens, unless the parents say don't delete it.
Does that then imply that we have to notify parents when that's being deleted?
Maybe. Possibly. Again, it's there's what the law says. I'm not in charge of the actual how we implement that. That's to be seen. Some of this might need to be cleaned up a bit, but it possibly could lead to that. Yes. Also, operators need to publicly disclose material about the collection, use, and disclosure of covered information, including terms of service, privacy policies, or similar documents. One of the things that you'll need to do once this law is implemented is districts will need to basically post these documents on your website or somehow make them available that has all this information in. So what is the company's privacy policy? What are they doing with the data? Why are you giving it to them? How is it being used? All those things will need to be publicly disclosed. Let's talk about that. So you'll have to have a written agreement with these operators in order to exchange data, right? And that written agreement needs to have a few things in it. It needs to have a listing of the categories or types of info provided. So what data elements are you giving that provider? They need to be listed, what they are. Why is it being done? Well, it's covered here in the statement of the product or the service being provided. So why is the data being given to this provider and for what purpose? That'll be covered by that. So what will this app do? We give them this data, what will it do for our kids? And this is interesting. So this is actually kind of a FERPA thing, but you also would need to have some sort of statement within this document that basically says that this provider is acting as a school official with a legitimate educational interest, performing a function which would the school would otherwise use employees under the direct control of the school and is using the info for covered purposes. That's something that's pulled out of FERPA, but now it's in our law too, which is so this provider is going to be sort of like an employee of the district. Well, for the purposes of using the data, yes, but that also implies that if they're an employee of the district, they have used that data, that the school has some level of control over that data. And it goes back to that, why are we giving it to them, and is there some sort of way that the school is going to control that? Yeah, hopefully. So you need to have some written agreement with the school board in order to exchange the data. So you can't sign up for an app and then give them data without having some sort of written agreement. So would this preclude a district from having teachers download an app and use in their classroom for an iPad district, or even if you're not like a Google district too, you can also download apps. Would that possibly prevent that from happening in the future, or severely limit that? It could, but there needs to be some sort of written agreement before information can be transferred. Also says between us too, and boy, we collect a lot of data from you guys. So does that mean we have to have 852 separate agreements, 852 school districts? Maybe. Again, too, any of the operators you give data to cannot disclose covered information to third parties unless there is an agreement in that. So if a company then uses a third party to help provide some sort of provide their services, can they give that data and pass it on? Yeah, they have to have that covered in this agreement. It has to be something that all the parties know about beforehand and agree to.
Harry?
Yeah.
I'm thinking that paragraph is meaning when they keep mentioning ISBE, school board or ISBE would be like if ISBE already had an agreement with, say, Pearson, for example, or IAR, then that agreement applies to us as school districts underneath ISBE.
I'm not sure if, well, maybe. It would be nice if that's the case. Again, that's a legal question. I'm not a lawyer, but if we had some sort of state master contract for Pearson to provide assessment services for all students in Illinois, if we sign that master contract as State Board of Education and those services are provided to schools through us, would that data agreement cover also you guys as well? Right. Question for the lawyers and implementation, but I hope so for your sakes, just because it would make it a lot easier. You don't have to have that separate data agreement. Otherwise, we would have to then have Pearson, and then you guys have then have to have 852 agreements between Pearson and all the school districts, in addition to the one that we have with Pearson. It's just a lot of overhead, a lot of work. That could be what ends up happening. I'm thinking hopefully your idea goes, but again, that's more of a legal implementation question. I'm not sure where they plan on that, but I'm hoping that that could happen, because I know there's quite a number of services that are done at the state level that also then pass down to the school districts, that a master contract would make it a lot easier for that whole process. Because, and I'm sure Pearson would probably appreciate just negotiating with one entity as opposed to 852 others besides ISBE.
Because I think that goes with College Board though.
Yeah.
With PSAT, but
Yeah.
also with all AP testing and all
Yeah.
that, does every high school have to have a contract with them? And like we
Again,
were
this is-
talking, it's,
Yeah, again, this is something that we may end up having some things on master contracts like the Pearson College Board. There could be also master contracts done with a lot of districts using Google Apps for Education or Office 365, things that a lot of different districts use, they're using pretty much in very similar ways, might be able to cover it. Hopefully, again, this is more of an implementation question. We have to get the lawyers to parse it out, but I would hope that just having been a former tech director not too long ago, that would be one of those things you do. Okay, cool. If this was going to handle it, I'm good with that. And I'm sure Pearson, College Board, Microsoft, Google would also appreciate not having to negotiate individual agreements with every single school district in the state of Illinois. We have the most, 852 of them, so that's not an insignificant number. And then, of course, all those have to be negotiated. Lawyers have to sign off. The boards have to adopt it. Yikes! But I don't know. That's something again. Lawyers have to figure out and parse. So, all right, some other things that need to be done with this too. So if there is some sort of breach, and this is a breach that happened and it's shooting to the operator. So let's say you subscribe to a cloud service and that service gets breached. There needs to be information in your agreements that kind of covers this topic. So how do costs and expenses incurred by a school be allocated between that operator and the school? So basically, delineation of who's going to pay for what in case a breach happens. These costs and expenses could include, things like notifications. It could include credit monitoring, legal fees, any other notices and things that we might have to incur. So the bottom line is any other notifications required by state, federal, or ISBE regulations. So you're going to have some specific language in there about this topic. So if something happens and it needs to be addressed, well, who's addressing it? That could be kind of an open question now. That's going to have to be pretty defined moving forward when this goes into effect. You'll also need to have an agreement in there, some language in there about what happens when the data is no longer needed. So students transfer, student leaves, they graduate, just don't need it anymore. There has to be some language in there on how the deletion process takes place if the data is no longer needed by any of the parties. It also needs to specify the time period when that takes place. So we don't want data just to be out there forever. It needs to have some sort of expiration date. Yes?
Do you anticipate that's going to match up with the maintenance of our paper records?
That's a good question.
Files and files and files, computer files in my sorters.
Well, that's a good question, because some of the paper records need to be kept for, I think there's some records that need to be kept like 70 years. When we talk about that, I don't know. That is a good question.
Because our district talks about taking some of those things and going digital with those.
Yeah, which that makes a record. That's data. Well, kid graduates. How long do we need to keep that for? 10 years, 20 years, 70 years? Or can we just get rid of it when they no longer need it? So it might matter on the type of data. If it's just like name, password, or login, maybe we don't need that if the kid's no longer with us, they graduate. Okay. But what if it contains academic performance records, things like that? Well, some of the other records laws might apply to that piece of data. So again, this is what this law says, but there are other laws that could come into play. The Records Act, definitely, if there's some sort of record of an academic nature, there's specific other laws that might apply that in terms of you got to keep that for X amount of years. In some cases, 7 decades. I don't know. That, again, a legal question, but these are all good things to consider. What exactly are we talking about here? What type of data? That's going to matter, because some of it may be deleted immediately, like a login. The kid's no longer with you. I don't need a login. Matter of fact, having a login out there and the person no longer with your district, that's a security issue, right? But if that record also contains academic progress and other diagnostic information, maybe that falls on the Records Act, and now we need to keep that a bit longer. It may depend on the data, but again, that's something we'll have to get the lawyers to opine on and figure out. So, I'm a lawyer. I'm not even on YouTube. So again, you'll have to publish written agreements, and those agreements need to be on a website, so your school website. Now, this actually came up. So I was at the IATC conference last week, and the district said, we don't have a school website. Okay, really? So what happens then? Well, not so fast. If you don't have a website, you still have to make these agreements available for inspection. So yeah, like you have to publicly announce like board meetings, things like that, have records available and packets available. If someone were to come by your district office and ask for them, you'll have to do the same with this. So interesting enough, that district said that they did that because they were concerned about having a accessible website. They didn't have anybody on staff that knew how to program a website to make it accessible. They're a very small school district way downstate. Okay, that's a good reason, I guess. So they're using Facebook. The next question was, hey, does this apply to Facebook? Like your Facebook's your webpage. Like, that's interesting. And then, boy, that's a good question. Perhaps. And a lot of the genesis, a lot of the advocacy of parent groups and stuff to push for this law to be passed in the form that it is, came from concerns about using Facebook. I don't know. Again, that was a really good question. We're taking that one back, but something to consider. But yeah, if you do have a website, you'll have to make these agreements on your website somewhere available for people to view. And if you don't, they still need to be somehow accessible and available for parents to inspect. Usually in your district office or some school office. So. All right, so if a breach does occur, the operators have a duty to notify school districts that the breach occurred within 30 days of becoming aware of it, 30 calendar days. They also need to provide a list of any third parties or affiliates to whom covered information is currently or has been disclosed. So again, this, a lot of services may end up contracting with other services to provide different parts of it. So, Schoology is a nice LMS, but they also contract with a lot of different agencies that kind of offer different services to plug into it. Well, there's some sort of data disclosure that needs to be accounted for in these agreements. It needs to be disclosed, and they need to tell you if that's happening. And this list has to be updated at the beginning of each fiscal year and the beginning of each calendar year. So fiscal year starts July 1st, calendar year, obviously January 1st. So really, every 6 months, that list needs to be updated.
So how does this then really applies to Google add-ons then too? If you use add-ons for metadata.
It could. Those are third parties. Plugins that use Google data plug into it, and then when you load those things, they ask like, hey, do you have permission to see these things? Yeah, it's very possible, but this will apply to that. How do we get data agreements with those folks? I don't know. That's all good questions. All right, so what about schools? So let's talk about operators. What do the schools need to do with this? So just like the prohibitions on operators, you can't sell, lease, rent, or trade information for your own students. So no selling the information to make money, sorry. Also, you can't disclose information to other parties other than the parent, school personnel, school board, ISBE, without a written agreement. So unless a specific exemption, so if there's a law enforcement investigation going on, or something that's needed in order to protect the security, safety, and privacy, of the students, okay. If it's required by a court order, so if there's some sort of investigation, there's a subpoena, you're going to have to comply, you have to get the data. Or if there's some other legal or regulatory compliance issue. Like,
in terms of the sharing and transparent information, this came up last year with an 8th grade parent who was not going to our high school, they were going to a private school.
mm-hmm.
What is the rule in that case of our responsibility with sharing information with them at the high school? Because we are in a school district, but technically is a different entity And what upset the parent was we transferred all the information to the high school like we've done for years.
Okay.
But then the high school reached out to the parents talking about all this stuff and, come here, like you sold my data. We had no intention of going to that high school. So that constitutes you selling our data to an entity we did not give you permission to give. So what is usual?
Were you aware that they weren't going to attend the high school, or?
No. But they basically said we had no right to give their contact information to the high school because we never notified the parents. We were giving that data to the high school because that was just, a lot of us are dealing with that because we're from Illinois, like the ones from school district. So,
right.
So what's ISBE's stance on sharing data? Which is true. Technically, it's us sharing it with a different entity that's not us.
It's sharing with a different entity. You may have to have some sort of integration to do that. So if you're a K district sharing data with high school, because it's not one of these other things, so you can share with the parent without the agreement.
Entities are asking.
School personnel, well, that school personnel more than likely applies to your own district, not an outside district. So maybe your own school board. ISBE, obviously, because of all the data transfers and stuff, but another school district, like you feed into a high school district, separate district, that might require an agreement. I don't know. Again, that's more so a legal interpretation question, which I can't, opine on legally, but it seems that it could, there's a possibility that it could require some sort of agreement on that, or at least letting parents know that at some point, hey, we're about to transfer data to the high school. If you're an 8th grader, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're doing it, and then have some sort of different opt-out perhaps. But again, that's something that, we don't know if that's what the answer is to this, or whether that's something that would be required districts to do once this becomes effective. It is a good question.
Yeah, and that's what we were advised to do, just in terms of, because we are parents, but in terms of that notification. So all 8th grade parents know that if you do not let us know by this date, and which is, for us, is the last day of school. You don't let us know by the last day of school, your records are going to go to the service, the high school. So, but we were told that
a lot of what's in this law is borne out by a lot of parent concerns that there's a lot of information that's being shared. They're not always aware of it. And so, the intent of the law was to basically compel districts through legislation that they're going to have to disclose what the data is being collected, why it's being collected, who's being shared by, and give parents notification and the ability to say no. So, in that situation, Mike, if those things were, that might be something that you may have to do, like let those folks know, like, that they're set as far as letting them know, hey, as of March, we need to transmit, names, addresses, all this information to the high school, so allow them to register your kids in the fall semester or even in the summer school. If you have an objection to it, if you're going to a different location, we're not aware of it, things like that, and they need to get a notification and basically wait to see if any of the parents contact the district and say, oh, we're not going to that high school, we're going to this high school. Okay. And then do we have permission to then give that data to that school? I know it's going to add another thing we need to do, another burden. And a burden perhaps, but that might be what the law requires. Again, we're 18 months away from the enactment date of the law. There's obviously going to be some things that have to come out, some guidance as far as what exactly do districts need to do with that. Obviously, there's going to be taking a look at this law, then taking a look at the Illinois Records Act to see where those two are in alignment, where those two may be in conflict, and maybe some tweaks that need to happen with that. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but that sounds like it's something that may need to happen potentially in order to comply with the law. But again, we have 18 months and things could change. All right, so a few other things that you need to do on your website. You'll also need to post what data you're collecting, why it's being collected, and where it's being disclosed to. Again, why are you doing it? How are you using it? To whom or what entities is the data being disclosed to, and for what purpose? List of all the operators that the data is being disclosed to. So, along with a copy of the agreement and the business address of each of the operator. And here's a kicker. Within 10 days of signing an agreement with that operator, that has to be up on your website once this law becomes effective. So you sign a contract with a new provider, you get a new LMS, you get a new service. Within 2 weeks, 10 days, that's calendar days, not school days, because it doesn't say school days. Within 10 calendar days, you need to put that notice and that information up on your website. Also, if there's any subcontractors to that bottom line says, any list of any subcontractors who cover information may be disclosed. So if your service employs other services to make parts of that work, those subcontractors need to also be disclosed in those agreements as well. So,
Eric?
Yeah.
We have a question from someone online.
Oh, go ahead.
So they asked, we outsource our IT infrastructure and networking staff. Will we need to implement a written agreement with them now regarding student information?
Okay, I'm sorry, you say it again. So you have an IT shop and.
Says we outsource our IT infrastructure and networking jobs. We will need to implement a written agreement with them now regarding student information.
We don't have to do it now. The law doesn't go into effect until 2021, until July 1st, 2021. So there's still time. I don't know if that's asking you, are you needing to implement a contract now, or is this?
I think they're asking just with this new law happening now, is that something that will be required? Within the next 18 months.
Does that IT services company handle any sort of the data flows or any of the transferring of data between services the school uses? It potentially could. I mean, I'm not sure the specifics exactly what that IT does. If they're the ones actually handling data and providing, hey, here's, yeah. Potentially, that potentially could be the case, yeah. So, yes.
Just relevant to that, wouldn't it matter, like whose property the Active Directory server is, or like who the server belongs to? Like, if they have an IT crew and their IT crew is like, they're managing the equipment, but they don't own the equipment. So, I don't know. I mean, it may be a lawyer question.
Oh, I'm sure it is.
Because
well, it's a similar question. So, what if I don't own the server the stuff is sitting on, but I basically subscribe to a cloud service, someone else's server, and they're also hosting not only my stuff but other people's stuff too. So, do I need a data share? Right, but then who's the person I need to make the agreement with? So, in a situation like yours, if you're outsourcing your IT operation to a IT shop that basically has the stuff off-prem and they get their own data centers or stuff, your agreement would be with that operator. So if it's like the Acme IT company, for example, I just hope there isn't an Acme one, I'm just using it as an example. Your agreement would be with Acme, you know, the guy that's with the ambulance, perhaps. But again, this is something that, you know, we're probably going to need to get some lawyers to opine on as well. Yes.
Regarding kind of the agreements, I think I read or was told, so maybe just kind of clarifying, is there kind of like an expectancy of being grandfathered in with existing contracts? Like, let's say I've got a 2-year deal with Skyward starting next year. I don't really have to deal with them until my contract renews with them 3 years later.
There's no language in the law that refers to any sort of grandfathering or reciprocal, you know, prior agreements. So, good question, but I don't think that that's going to work. But again, I'm not a lawyer, but I know that there's no mention of grandfathered agreements. Oh, right, sure. You sign a 5-year contract for a company to provide the services, and oh, wait, this implementation date's in the middle of that contract. Do I have to renegotiate my contract? Maybe. That's a good question. Yes.
So on that point, the law states so if it goes back to July 1, 2021, that's for any agreement entered into, amended, or reviewed.
Okay.
So if it's continuing on, it's a matter of once this law was in effect.
Okay.
Entering into an agreement, amending an agreement, or renewing. Now, what constitutes an amendment?
Thank you.
But that's
Clear as mud, right?
Can you say that one more time so we can just continue to?
Sure. So it's from the bill, and it says any agreement entered into, amended, or renewed must contain all the following. So that this doesn't go into effect until the effective date. So starting in July 1, 2021, if you are entering into an agreement, amending an agreement, or renewing an agreement, you have to meet all of those requirements.
I kind of feel like I could slow up some
So
contracts
enter
now.
into
Just so we're clear, ISBE is not telling, not saying you should do that. Just for the folks that are recording this.
But this sounds tough.
Also, an important thing is the definition of operator, which is an operator of the internet application, an online service, website, mobile application with actual knowledge. So that may not count contractors because they're not operating a website as lawyers. The lawyers will have to.
There's also the clauses and stuff that says basically anybody who handles data. So there may be some
different
we're going to find issues like this with this law because, like, well, they're not a contractor by that definition, but yet they're handling PII, and other parts of the law says that they're handling PII, they need to have a written agreement with those people at entities. So
And
which one supersedes the other? You know, yeah. A good point. Yeah, right. They're not technically operators under that definition, but they're handling data. And so,
Well, it said that you have to have an agreement for the school to have an agreement with anyone except like parents, ISBE, and school staff, right?
and the school board, yeah.
And school board. So then everyone else. So even if, for example, you have an IT crew, that, so let's say you outsource IT, right?
Right. And that's the point I was trying to make with him. Yeah.
The school starts with the data, but you have to provide it to a third party, even if you bring it back on your own servers.
That potentially could require at least some sort of agreement that says that they have the right to, this is what they're doing with the data, this is why we're giving it to them, the purpose, handling our systems, they have to have that spelled out. Yeah, so not an operator, but that other clause applies. Again, but does one supersede the other? I don't. Fun stuff, isn't it? All right, moving on. So more stuff on this written description procedures. So you're going to also need to have on your website information about how parents can basically inspect and review the data. So going back to giving parents and students right over the data, this is getting some of that. So parents have the right to inspect and review data. You need to have procedures on how they're going to do that listed on your website. Right? Could be, those procedures are not defined yet. If you don't have a website, you'll have to provide some method by which they can get paper copies. There also needs to be some sort of procedure and process for which parents can go and have request corrections of things that they find inaccurate. So parents, if they object to a piece of data or want to correct something, you have 90 days to rule on it and either decide that yes, it needs to be corrected, or no, we're right, and here's why. If the data resides with the operator ISBE, they have 90 days to correct the error. If the data is corrected, then you have to they have 10 days to basically notify the parent that the correction has been made. So you need to let them know what that procedure is, how they can expect the data, and it also has some procedure on which a corrections process can be done. So if the parent thinks that there's some data that needs to be corrected, you need to have a procedure to be able to handle that.
So I have a question on that because we've contacted ISBE, who's the operator of all the SIS. And if there is a student that is marked, let's say LEP, limited English proficiency, that should not be, ISBE will not allow us to make that change, even though all documentation, the parent has requested it. So if it's out of our control, what do we do?
Good question.
Because it looks like this law is telling us we have to notify ISBE, the parent requested it to be changed.
Right.
But I can't change it. The
Right.
state has to change it?
Okay, going back to what I said earlier about this law also applies to ISBE.
Okay.
So our practices are going to be changed. So that's
Got
a
it.
specific example of something that, hey, wait a minute. So
Yeah,
your case where there's a piece of data that's wrong, you have proof that it's
I
wrong.
have all the proof.
And you're calling us saying it's wrong, you can change it. We're telling you, no, it can't be changed.
Yep.
Well, wait a minute, this law says it has to be changed. Yeah.
Got
we
it.
need to change the procedure ourselves. Yeah. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, no, there's going to be some changes. We're going to, it's going to get some fun here. And yeah, that's a good example of some, like, well, hey, what about this data? And yes, we also are holes of a huge amount of data. So how do we then correct the errors that you guys are reporting to us, or that your parents are noticing? I don't know yet, but we're going to come up with something because we're subject to this as well. Okay. Okay, another part that you'll need to also disclose, if you have any breaches that occur, you'll need to disclose that information on your website. So the breaches will need to list a couple of things. So number of students that are affected, unless the member violates the Personal Information Protection Act. So if I disclose the number, I could use that to identify specific students, and you're exempted. But otherwise, it doesn't apply. Then you'll have to list, okay, 100 students were affected, whatever the number is. The date or the estimate date of when that breach happened. So if you know exactly on that date, list it. If you're not sure, but between this date and this date, you got to list the range. The name of the operator, if an operator is involved with this. And you would need to update this list twice a year. So no later than 30 days to start the fiscal year, July 1st. No later than 30 days to start of the calendar year. Right? Now, a couple things where you don't have to do this. So if a breach is extremely small, so if the affected population is less than 10% of your enrollment, you don't have to, again, because a small sample size could end up leading to someone figuring out who that might have been. So if that's the case, you don't have to do this. Anything that happened prior to the enactment date of the Act. So anything that happens now, no, you don't have to disclose that. After July 1st, 2021, you probably do. Also, once this gets going, any breaches that occurred more than 5 years prior to the last update, you can take those off. That obviously won't go into effect for a while, but 2027, 28, you can, if there was an incident happening in 2021, those can come off the list, but they have to be within the 5 years, beyond 5 years of the last update. So you'll have to disclose breaches. I know there's been some concerns about doing that could invite, attacks perhaps, but what you have to do.
You got 6 or 7 breaches up there. They looking good.
Yeah.
People like you must be.
This was, believe me, there were a lot of people in the room, some school districts and educational advocacy groups that were concerned about this. So you don't have to provide a whole lot of more detail than what's listed here. So you don't have to go into detail exactly what was breached or anything like that. But there was a lot of back and forth, but they still kind of maintain that, yes, breach notifications need to take place. And you'll have to disclose them. So there was an attempt to try to downplay this a little bit, but it's still in there, unfortunately. For those of you that feel it shouldn't be. Yeah. You'll have to notify the parents, obviously, if this happens, no later than 30 days, calendar days. It actually says calendar days, after the notice of the breach or determination of the breach occurred. So there's a time limit here. You'll have to give them the same type of information posting on your website. So when did this happen, or estimated range, a description of the covered information that was breached. Now, this wasn't on the other slide. You don't have to list this on your website, but you do need to tell parents. Okay, so just make that distinction. Part of the compromise on disclosing all this information out there is that, well, if I tell them it was breached and stuff, would that make it more of an attack? Someone else is going to try to get that? Yeah, perhaps. Don't have to put it on your website, but you do have to tell the parents. So a little bit of a compromise and a way to sort of that one. You'll also need to have some sort of information as to how parents can contact the operator of the website that the breach occurred with. So if they have any questions, phone number or email address or something. Here's some other information you need to include. So there's going to be information about toll-free numbers, addresses, and websites of consumer reporting agencies and the Federal Trade Commission. So that'll have to be part of your breach notification letters. And this sounds like this might be some stuff we might be able to put out templates for you down the line. Perhaps this will be in there. Some sort of statement that the parent can obtain from the FTC and consumer agencies, some sort of credit monitoring type services. And that'll have to be included in the notices as well. Now, you can delay, and there's a lot of things that will come out, but it says notification can be delayed if a law enforcement investigation determines that it's not a good idea at this time to disclose to the parents. So if there's an active investigation and they tell you, don't say to your parents just yet because we're still investigating, okay. But as soon as they don't have that hold on anymore, you have to let the parents know. Again, normally 30 days after notification is received, unless law enforcement tells you that, no, not yet, because of the investigation. That's the only exception. But then once that is no longer the case, and they allow you to disclose it, you'll have to disclose. Yeah.
We have a question online.
Yeah.
Kind of going back to the agreement for a second.
Sure.
It says for giant companies, Google, Microsoft, et cetera, that don't have salespeople or legal people that we can really be in contact with us. How do we get those agreements? And are these companies aware that they're going to have to do this?
A lot of those companies started to become aware through the legal process. A lot of those companies were involved in legislative discussions or through trade groups and stuff. As far as notifications or who to contact, like, hey, who do I put on there if like there's a breach at Google? Like, are they going to be able to call somebody in Mountain View or someone in Microsoft? That's a good question. I'm not sure on that one at this point.
Well, I think the question even though is even geared towards us, like we need to do these individual agreements with Microsoft, whatever potentially. Like most of us have tried to call Google at a time and can never talk to them.
Well, not just bigger companies, even small companies and stuff, they really rather you just contact them by email. It's usually education@whatevercompany.com, right? Good question. Yeah, I don't know on that one. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that Microsoft's not going to want all these parents calling, their sales folks. So will they have to set up special numbers for this? Maybe, or some sort of method of contact, perhaps. I at this point don't know.
They'll notify you.
Yeah. Right, but the law certainly says that there needs to be some contact information you can provide to the parents in case they have questions about what happened. So, if there's a major breach and stuff, and parents really want to talk to somebody at the company, you give them the number and it's never answered, that could be an issue for you guys. So I don't know. It's a good question. Provide us a note about that. All right, some of the things that you'll have to do, again, this should sound familiar because this was on the duties that the providers need to do. So you, as a school district, need to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures that meet or exceed industry standards to protect covered information. What is a reasonable security procedure? And what does it mean to meet and exceed the standards? I don't know. It's not spelled out. That's some area that we're going to look into. Interesting to note, though, is that this also applies to any third party whom covered information is disclosed to. So contractors or companies that you contract with for services, if they then have third parties that also plug into the service, will also need to provide those same standards in their agreements. Bottom thing, ISBE is required to create a guidance document pertaining to reasonable security procedures and practices. So I have no idea what those mean yet, but I'm going to have to come up with an answer at some point between now and July 2021. So those of you that think that this doesn't apply to us or we're not going to give this information run, right? We can't do that because we're legislatively required to tell you what this is. We're working on it. And also, we could use some feedback from you all because, yes, I was a tech director for 13 years. I'm no longer one, so I don't deal with the day-to-day stuff. I'm not maintaining any of the computer networks or systems at ISBE. But you guys certainly are in your own district. So things that you're doing in terms of cybersecurity and practices that seem to work in your districts, we'll definitely want to know what those are. Some things that maybe aren't working so well, we'll want to know about those too. So any sort of feedback you can give us to preparation of the guidance document, like what Jeff was saying with the e-learning stuff, we'll definitely want to know that.
I think somebody mentioned when you go past or reset my laws, it sends it in clear text.
Oh, I seem to remember about 20 minutes ago said that there's going to be some changes that need to be done in terms of practice at ISBE. That would be a change that we may need to make, probably will need to make on that. So, yeah. That's the other thing too. One of the chief things that was really sort of from the outset is that whatever policies that this LAC was going to run the schools, that the State Board of Education, if we're going to take the lead on it, we're going to be affected by the same law. So if we're going to tell you to do these things, they want to make really darn sure that we're doing the same things. And so it's in the legislation. So yeah, we probably aren't going to want to keep doing that. But yeah, if you need your password reset in iOS, we'll email it to you in clear text, which is not a good idea. That's not best practice. Yes, that's something that the IT folks are aware of that needs to be changed and doesn't comply with this. And I'm also telling you that, hey, I get beat up with it every time I do this. It's like someone mentions that, so it's like, help me out, guys. They're beating me up over it.
And so,
You're violating our policy. Okay, we're guilty, sorry. But yes, we are going to need to take a look at all those things that we're doing and finding out areas that need that on the line and start changing the practices ourselves.
and you have no idea when you have this done.
We're hoping to get something out to districts well in advance of that implementation date. So it gives you guys some time to look over it. Ideally, and then this is just me saying this, I'd like to get something out to you guys probably within sometime this summer, a year before this goes into effect, because I want you folks to take a look at it. I want you guys to offer some comment on it. Give us some advice as to whether or not, hey, that's a great idea, or oh my God, this is terrible, here's why. Just so it's not a last minute thing, because these are guidance documents that we're going to provide to the state. We also realize too that there's a great diversity in 852 districts from like Chicago down to Cairo and Danville all the way out to Rock Island. So whatever we come up with will need to be tweaked and modified to your own district's and communities' needs. So we'll need to also get something out to you guys well in advance to that.
Yeah, because I mean, because a lot of times there's things that have to go through attorneys.
That too.
Or legal things
Yep.
to be drawn up.
Yep.
And that takes time.
Yep. So hopefully we'll have something for you guys here. Like I said, I would really like to get it to you sometime this summer, but that is just me talking. I'm not speaking for the agency on that one as far as the timeline. Again, because it has to go to lawyers and because there's a lot of, ISBE is a government agency and there's, inertia trying to get things going sometimes. There could be some delays in that, but I would like to see, this is just Eric Rocky talking, I'd like to see some guidance given to the districts sometime by the summer. But I'm not speaking to the agency in that yeah, as we said, we'll have some by the summer. Not saying that at all, I can't say that. I don't know what the timeline is on it yet, but I'm hopeful that at least my hope is that we can get some to you guys well in advance of the implementation date, just to have the time for feedback and for modification, for comment. And the fact that whatever we come out with is going to have to be modified by all of your districts for your own local needs and things. And we can't possibly give a blanket policy that will apply equally to Chicago and to Springfield and to Cairo and to Rockford and to, Pekin or wherever. That everyone's got to tweak it a little bit. And so you'll need to have time to do that. And it's not fair if we, hey, it's July 29th or June 29th, here's your policy. No, it would be a bad thing. So, but again, like I said, that's my hope that we can get something to you soon rather than much later. But we're working on it. So here's something that's interesting. So the law says that you're going to need to designate specific people in your districts that are authorized to enter into these agreements. So tech directors normally sign contracts or recommend purchases. Okay, that could be a tech director, but here's a question. So my district, when I was tech director, the early childhood classrooms, other kindergarten, first grade classrooms had iPads. I allowed my teachers to download apps to try them out with their kids. They would just go ahead and download them. Okay, that's cool. We had a little app store, custom app store that we would put apps in and they can download them to their machines as needed. And that worked out pretty well. Can they still do that? Or am I going to need to give that authorization to those teachers? I don't know. That's a good question, because does that require an agreement, those apps, if there's data being transferred? Potentially. What type of data is being exchanged? Names, perhaps could be PII if it's a full name. If even first names could be. So that's a good question. I don't know. As soon as I put that one up there, someone always asks that. Like, that's a good question. Right? That potentially could be. Like I said, that's something we're just going to first out. You'll also need to designate a privacy officer that's mainly going to be in charge to implement this stuff. This could be a person that does the record stuff. It could be someone else. They're not really too specific on it, other than saying that it could be the person that the custodian of records. So you have to have at least, it could be the same person for both those jobs, but you will need to designate those folks, or both, this one person. So
when you say designate, does that mean there will be literally somebody registered with ISBE that is just in-house designate?
good question. The law says basically designate somebody. It doesn't say who they need to be reported to. it could be something in-house. There's nothing in the statute that says you have to report that to us, but that could be, now the statute doesn't say that. Could there be future rules developed where you have to do that based on rule? Maybe. Don't know yet.
So we don't.
Again, too, if they, now this is a little like, whoa, wait a minute. Take a look at that one. Public schools shall make requests to operators to delete covered information of a parent request so long as deletion of this info is not in violation of state or federal record laws. So what if a parent objects to any use of technology at all? Can they then call the district, say, I want my data deleted from all these systems? And will I have to then do that unless we can't? So obviously you can't delete the ISBE data if we need it. You have to get that information, but I don't want my kid using Google Apps. I want my data deleted off Google. If I'm a parent, I'm calling you to do that. You have to do it. Is this a backdoor kind of like allows a parent to just completely like mix technology at all for their kid?
I have a
Is
question.
there a backdoor way of doing it? I don't know, but I've had people comment when I see this, like, wait a minute, what? Yes.
So Eric, would it be something to think about in terms of moving forward? Because I had emailed you way back when this first came up and asked, does ISBE have a list of things that people could go on? And he was like, no. You know, I've had some instances that I've.
Oh, okay, I know who you are now.
Yeah,
Yes,
yes.
yes.
Okay.
Good to meet you in person finally. Okay, yes.
Okay. So would it be beneficial to us to consider, like, where if we know that there are specific things that we have approved, board approval, you know, you have an agreement to use Schoology and this, that, and the other, to send a correspondence out to the parents to get their agreement that their kids are going to be using these learning platforms or whatever. The district is going to be utilizing Schoology, Google, whatever it is, and we need your permission. And then that way, that will be a way that we can cover. We can get like that up front. Registration. Yeah, like a part of the registration process.
You know, that's not a bad idea in terms of implementing some of this. Again, you know, the actual requirements of what you need to do in terms of notification, permission from parents. It could be a legal question. So with that caveat being put out there, again,
it's a way to cover.
It may be, yeah, it may be a good way to do it. And if you're getting all this information, typically at registration time, you have a lot of forms, stuff that people sign off on. It could be a good time to do that. So, yeah. Yes.
I don't want my kids.
So there was originally in this bill, there was a parent opt-in.
Yeah.
For consent, and it came out. And this stayed in, and the point was that was negotiations of the bill that this is maybe a backdoor opt-out. And the advocate's response was, no, that's not the intent. And so it didn't get changed. So that wasn't the intent, but then this is, I think, become an issue in other states that have had this, where you can effectively backdoor it, and it just didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, no, I was part of those discussions. I remember that. That's why I'm bringing this up, because I've had people look, I'm like, wait a minute, that's bad.
Because originally the advocates of the bill wanted it to be parent opts in to one-on-one program.
Right.
And that just doesn't work because you don't get the opt-out.
This one will have to bear some watching, and probably will need to be revised at some point. But like,
there's a question that came online. If a teacher has students sign up for a website, the teacher is not authorized to enter into the agreement, does that count as a breach? Or the breaches have to be malicious? Or, as a general question, if someone unauthorized enters an agreement, is that considered a breach?
Legal questions. Not a lawyer. With that said, though, I'm not sure what would happen if someone after this law goes into effect signs up for an app for their kids, gives information to the provider. Is that entering into an agreement, and are they authorized to do so? And what happens if they're not authorized? Is that yanked? Is it just canceled as a matter of against public policy? I don't know. You're asking some legal questions on that. And as far as it being a breach, if someone obviously if they're not authorized to enter an agreement and did so anyway, is that unauthorized, and then is that a breach? Again, legal question, but it may be.
Well, I guess they're asking.
Yeah.
If from.
But these are all good. Keep them coming, but these are all good questions we'll take back. And when we start talking with lawyers and with other folks and stuff that deal with policy, hey, what about this? Hey, what about this? What about this? These are all good things. And it could be that, maybe some of this language needs to be tweaked and we need to go back to the legislators like, hey, if there's, a lot of districts are saying this is a problem, then these are the issues that they're saying they're going to have if we enact this in its current form. So even though I'm I might sound like I got a lot of questions, not all answers. I'm sorry. Yeah, but a lot of these things, are asking are really good questions, but they involve an interpretation of law, and I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a tech guy like you guys. So, but I will take it back to the lawyers for consideration for rulemaking.
I personally think this is long overdue, because I just think there's so many, websites and things out there being offered for free, and people just sign up for things willy-nilly.
Sure.
This is long overdue.
Yeah, a lot of parents felt that way. Okay, so I talked to, yes, Vern.
I would think, Eric, that with this new state law, would there be a way for either ISBE or like the Illinois Learning Technology Purchase Program where there's already things in place that for agreements? So what I'm saying is just an agreement that just spells out the terms of this law. Say, do they do this, do this,
well,
do this?
We're not alone in this. So there's 5 other states I know about that have basically done something similar to what we're attempting to do here. So Connecticut, New York, Colorado, New Hampshire, California, a bunch of other ones are considering it. So one of the things that's done in Connecticut, for example, is that Connecticut has an office called the Commission on Educational Technology. It's out of their education department. They actually have a website dedicated to this entire, their version of our law. They have a portal by which all of their agreements are uploaded into. And so districts can then sign master agreements and covers everybody. They have where districts, if they're unique, like, hey, we're using this ABC app, whatever, and it's only us that are doing it. Well, okay, go ahead and upload that, and that's fine. And then all the district has to do to comply with the reporting requirements, provide a link to that portal, and you're done. But you have to then maintain your records on the portal, obviously, but at least we give you a place to do that and a format to do it in. That is something we're talking about. I'm not saying that it's going to happen, but it is something that would be obviously a lot easier for you guys to have a central place to put all this stuff. Yay. And a central way of doing it. Yay. If we have to manage this, I'm going to want to have a central place, because otherwise having to dig through 852 district websites to find all this stuff is going to be a bit burdensome. So that would be a good thing for us if we charge with maintaining so that. So there could be a possibility that something like that could be developed as a way to comply. It's been done in other states, so it's something we're looking at.
I'm even thinking of if ISBE or the purchasing program already had the agreement document, then it'd be a matter of, oh, I'm using ABC company, so I go to there and just grab the agreement. And now
Well, like I said before, with that other question about the Pearson, because everyone uses Pearson for testing, because we're making you do that with the IAR, right? That's a master agreement that basically covers everybody in the state. Can we just go with that and just upload that, as opposed to contacting Pearson ourselves and negotiating all these other agreements? If we could do something like that, again, the lawyers on that one. But if that's something we could do, that would make life easier for everybody on that one. School districts, ISBE, Pearson, everybody wins in that scenario. So we're looking into something like that. It would make things dramatically easier for everybody. Can't guarantee that it's something we'll do at this point, but it is something we're talking about for sure. But yeah, take a look at that Connecticut. This Connecticut Commission on Educational Technologies, and I don't remember the website name. If you Google it, you'll see what they did. That's a potential way we could go about doing this. Colorado has a similar website. Trying to remember if New York does. New Hampshire is still implementing, and California's goes into effect this summer. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with those folks. So, but yeah, those are all good ideas and things we're looking into. Right? Yes.
On the same topic, even if Illinois doesn't have a massive centralized system, there still should be some kind of centralization to answer questions once for everybody, rather than having districts do it individually. Like, the biggest question I think is going to come up again and again is this operator or not under the law? And like one example I'm going to throw out there is like SurveyMonkey. You go to their website, there's nothing on that website about K-12.
This is stuff we need to know.
But SurveyMonkey is like, we're special ed at this table. We have professionals who want to use SurveyMonkey because it represents data in a way that no other platform can. But that's really sensitive information that's going into that. And if they're not operating, the law is very clear that it doesn't touch them at all. So like,
I know I've seen a lot of surveys from school districts that use SurveyMonkey as an engine.
Yeah.
I think even some ISBE surveys have been done with SurveyMonkey in the past too. So I think, don't go beyond where we're current users. I think in the past we've done things with that. So I didn't know that. That's good stuff.
And then similarly, like when we look at apps, there's services that charge money to help you vet whether apps could even be eligible for entry into a written agreement with the app developers, like education framework. Is like if the answer is going to be kind of the same for everybody, why should every district each have an independent subscription to education framework? And why can't this be something that ISBE does as a universal resource?
Good feedback. Now, that's something that we've started to talk about. Kind of goes to what you were saying a minute ago too. If there's some sort of central way of doing it. The previous question from way long ago about like, well, with Pearson and with Google and Microsoft, if everyone's using it, why not just have one master thing that covers everybody? Sure, why not? So I certainly, we have bring up a lot of valid points. All the states have done it that way. It would make implementation, and also who's going to be checking that districts are doing this, and if everyone's doing it all in the wrong ways, that's really how they do that. So good points. Again, that's potentially, yes. Also, there's a lot of, I have to look at all these requirements like, my God, it's like a lot of work too. If there's something that could be done centrally where some of that burden could be taken off and you have to do it, minimally instead of having to spend hours creating a separate part of your web page and uploading all these documents, yeah, because obviously I having done your jobs, I know that you're pulled in many different directions all the time and like, oh God, there's nothing I need to do. So I get it. And there's something we could do either through ourselves at ISBE or through the Learning Technology Centers to allow for some centralization of that. Obviously, that's something we're definitely going to want to explore, and we have been talking about it. So. And we do have some examples of other states where they've done it rather successfully. Connecticut, for example, does that rather well. That's a good model to take a look at. Okay, real quickly. So things that we have to do. We talked a lot about schools and a lot about providers. So what can we do and what can we not do as a state board of education? Well, we can't sell, rent, disclose, or trade the information ourselves. We can't disclose the information without a written agreement. So these are the same provisions that apply to the operators and to you guys. Something we do need to do, though, is we have to annually publish a list of all the entities or individuals that we have contract with when we share data. So they have to include the names, the address, the duration of contract, types of cover information. So this could be providers like for assessment, like Pearson. It could be researchers that are researching different things using data that we collect, because obviously we're a big data warehouse from all the district system information. All that stuff has to be disclosed. So who these people are, their names, their addresses, what they're doing with the data, how long their contracts and access to that data is for. It has to be done annually. So we're not doing that currently, but it will be up there by July 1st, 2021. A dictionary of all the data elements that are out there. So we're sort of doing this now. If you ever read the SIS stuff, there's documentation of all the fields and definitions and stuff. Kind of got some of that elements already started, but there's many different systems that collect many different pieces of data, not just SIS. That all has to be disclosed. And anything that goes into the longitudinal data systems, the data warehouse, so all that has to be disclosed. So we're kind of sort of started this process a little bit with some of the stuff on the SIS website, but that is going to be dramatically expanded, and all the other systems that feed into the longitudinal data system have to be reported out. So some of that's already done, some of that's in the process of being done, but it'll all come together into one dictionary dictionary for data. This guy, yes, we're aware of that. We need to provide the district's model guidance and policy documents. What's that?
Where you at on that?
Shut down, yeah, why not? Get with it. Yeah. So we also need to, part of that is model notice of parents, but operator types of data collected and for what purposes. So if you look at some of the other websites like Connecticut, you'll see these things on there. So these, again, our law was kind of patterned after some of the other states, and so some of the provisions, you know, the good news is that there are guideposts for even us out there too as to what we may need to provide to the district. So expect that there's going to be a lot more information coming from the state board about all this stuff. So things like what the policies look like, what elements of an agreement do I need to look for, what do I need to key in on, what do notices to parents look like. We're gonna have to give at least some examples to you guys on that. Obviously customize it to your own local needs and purposes, but we at least need to give you a framework or something to work off of. So we're not just gonna throw you like, hey, here's the law, have fun. You know, we can't do that. We have to not only change our own practices, but we also need to provide you with those guidance so you can implement it yourselves. So we are definitely involved in this. So interesting with this is that there are certain things that this act doesn't do, and it's actually in there. So one of the things is that obviously it's not going to limit the ability for law enforcement to collect information if they need to as part of an investigation or by subpoena or court order. So obviously, if there's something going on with legal matter or subpoenas and law enforcement involved, they'll have the ability to still get the data that they need to do whatever they need to do. One of the things, this is the second bullet point, is kind of important because there was an attempt to do this. The original law basically said that this was not allowed. That got taken out, and actually this was put in. So operators cannot, this act does not limit operators' ability to use the data for adaptive learning or customized learning experiences. But there was a lot of interesting discussion on this one because the original act, the original draft said this was a no-no. Basically, the IAR would have been done because you can't test. Well, it uses data to basically modify the test because you're taking it. You can't do that. So you can now, but yeah. There are some groups that were lobbying for this that also, if you take a look at some of their stuff, they really don't like that test either. But we're allowed to do it. I don't know what this means, but it's in here. Apply to general audience internet sites, even if they require logins. What is a general audience internet site? I don't know. Would that be Facebook? I don't know. Good question. I'm not sure what that means because Facebook does require a login in order to use it, to post to it. It requires a login, right? So does any social media site, Twitter, Instagram. Is that talking about things like that, social media sites, or is it, Blogger? It's a Google site. Google owns it, but sometimes websites are also blogs. I don't know what that means, but it's in there. There's things that it doesn't apply to, but I don't know if that's is a loophole or what.
Is that saying that general audience is not specifically
Possibly. Again, it's in there, and we're not quite sure because. Right. Well, Google by itself, just Google.com isn't necessarily directed towards schools, but obviously Google has Google Apps for Education, which definitely is. Good question. Again, we don't know what that clause means, but it's in that part of the legislation that says the act does not do this. And what does that mean? Yeah, so again, other companies can they can market to parents. So like Google can market to parents, as long as their marketing doesn't come from their kids' information. So a little kind of bone, I guess, to the big companies. So yes, Google can monetize your data with your Google Gmail accounts. They just can't use, if your kid is registered to Google Apps for Education School, they can't use that data to monetize ads towards you, though. That would be a no-no, but they can certainly use your data if you give it to them when you sign up for Google. Because you all read the usernames, right? Interesting. So this doesn't impose a duty on provider to review and enforce compliance with this act. Interesting. Students, you can't prevent the students from basically downloading, exporting, transferring, or saving their information. So again, they have control over their data. This doesn't supersede FERPA. Obviously, a state act does not supersede a federal act. FERPA is a federal law. Illinois Student Records Act, all provisions of that are still in force. So this does not modify, change, or supersede that act. So questions about student records and retention policies, those are all still in play. Nothing changed on those because of this. Interesting enough, there was a lot of debate about this one for some reasons, is that yearbook operators and school photographers were concerned that this act would prevent them from basically doing their job, producing yearbooks or actually taking photos, or coaches exchanging game films for athletic purposes and stuff based on this. They were worried about this. And there's some provisions to that that says not prevent prohibited operators or schools from producing and distributing photos or yearbooks. It doesn't say anything about game film though, but that was discussed. There was some concern because nowadays, school photographers, they'll get a list of the names and the ID numbers of the kids in order to match them with the photos they take, because they take them in rapid succession. They just bang them right through, right? So one of the things I had to do when I was a tech director is I had to give the photo company the ID numbers and the names of the kids. That's all it contained. And then so they just matched it up. And the kids would come with a card and they'd give it to the photographer to snap the picture, and they could match the kid with the picture later, right? They were worried that, well, do we need a data agreement with that? Well, it says that it doesn't prohibit them, but they're still getting personally identifiable information, right? So it says that they're allowed to operate it, but does that really say that they don't need a data agreement as they're giving them stuff like that? I don't know, maybe. Again, there's a lot of questions on implementation and the things that we're going to have to get some legal opinions on. But could potentially need something like that if we're getting information like that. Okay, so next step. So we got 19 months to implement this. So what do we all do in the meantime? So we're going to be working with partner agencies to develop these model guidance and policies. Obviously, we're going to get more feedback. We're going to have more sessions like this. We'll need to get some feedback from you guys. Let us know. Let us know your questions, your concerns, hey, what about this? Hey, this isn't going to work. All those things we'll need to know about to try to come up with some guidance, some policy documents that work for you guys. Some things that, like the SurveyMonkey thing, did not know that about SurveyMonkey, about the lack of that stuff. So that's good. Stuff like that are things that we need to know.
It's almost like they're trying to consider, like they're deciduous as, don't mention K-12.
Right, but we're already kind of questions about sites and stuff that don't specifically market to K-12 but are being used by K-12, like SurveyMonkey, or just like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. What about those? We're all using them. They're not marketed towards that. They're not marketed to K-12. None of those sites are, but yet they're in use. And certain pieces of data need to be transmitted to all three of those in order for that service to use. So because of that, does this apply? That's a really good question. Yes.
Yeah. The use for K-12 and use the word and, specifically, say that is for.
So that's for operators only, though. Section 26(x)(2) states that schools can't share information with an entity or individual, not necessarily operators, without a written agreement.
Right. I'm not a lawyer, yeah. But again, operators, semantics, right? It says operators, and also it says individuals or entities.
So operators just have more rules? Yeah, that's I have no clue about.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know why it's in there.
Yeah,
people pointed out to me. I added it to the slide because of that. I don't know what that means.
Maybe if they don't have student names or any other info or anything, but what would they do then? So
there's a couple of workshops that are coming up soon, some of which are being sponsored by the LTC, some of which are being sponsored by folks hosting SSA idea. The LTC, the Learning Technology Center. For those of you that don't know, the Learning Technology Center is an ISBE funded organization, so they're not ISBE, but we do provide some funds for them to operate that basically are out there to assist school districts with ed tech initiatives, with ed tech issues and problems. A lot of what they do are provided at either very little or no cost at all. So they're going to be holding some workshops. Actually, there's one going on right now in Rockford at noon, I think. So it's kind of funny that they're doing it out there. The same thing we're doing here. But they're holding workshops on the NIST cybersecurity frameworks. I believe those are free. You can just go to them. They're being held at different sites throughout Illinois for the next few weeks and months. So just check the website for the times, dates, and locations for those. They're also hosting, and still kind of bigger. So if you want a really good deep dive on the technical side of how to do this, as well as maybe some of the policy stuff, maybe hopefully may have something about that. But and also bringing in some experts and stuff that work in kind of more the policy and legal fields on this issue. January 14th and 15th at Naperville, I believe that's at the Naperville NIU campus, and then 16th and 17th in Springfield. The LTC is hosting a Secure Ed conference. It's basically 2 days. We'll talk about this, all this stuff for 2 days straight, not only for the policy and legal side of it, but also for your IT folks. Like, how do I secure switches and ports and all that stuff on the networking side of things? That is not free, but it's not terribly expensive. But again, ltcillinois.org to sign up for that and see what the sessions are. IdeaCon is coming up in February 24th through 27th. There'll be some additional cybersecurity sessions on that schedule, I believe. So with the 27th being a date just for IT directors, CTOs, IT staff, where they can really geek out and really deep dive some of the really, technical side of things. So that's coming up again. See ideaillinois.org for that, and just it's a good conference otherwise for all sorts of tech issues. COSN's also been hosting workshops around the country, webinars on what's called their Trusted Learning Environment Seal. Now that's basically a good way to kind of assess your cybersecurity standing. Getting the seal doesn't automatically mean you're totally in compliance with all that stuff, but it goes a long way. There is some cost to that though, so it's not a free thing, but it is a good process. A lot of districts are doing it throughout the country. I believe they did have one in Illinois here a few months back. I think their next one, if you can get it, it'd be cool. I think their next one's in Phoenix, so in February, which sounds kind of awesome to get out here in February if you can get down there. But I don't know if they're going to be any more sites in Illinois, but COSN.org is the website for that stuff. Things you can do, review the data privacy practices of the current ed tech vendors. If you're going to be signing contracts, there might be something you might want to look into if you're looking to adopt things that are new. Obviously, specific legal questions, I can't answer those. I'm not a lawyer, so ask your lawyers. One of the things too is that whatever you're doing, this isn't just an IT problem. I realize that a lot of you folks out here are probably the IT directors, CTOs of your districts, but this is an issue that is going to affect everybody in the district in some way, shape, or form. It can't just remain an IT issue to be talked about amongst IT folks in a room full of IT people, because this is almost like reading to the choir. Your strongest security is only as strong as your weakest link, and your weakest link in this situation is your users. So if you have an unaware user that clicks on something, you can have $1 million security in your data closets with the latest and greatest Cisco gear or whatever. User clicks on something, downloads an attachment, and launches a payload, bam, you've got a problem. And that's how a lot of these ransomware things get into the systems. People just, oh, this looks legit, and it's not, but they think it is, boom. Or they just didn't know, and they just, oh, I see attachment, I click on it. Yeah, don't do that. There's obviously an education effort here for all the users, and all the users literally mean all the users. So not just students, not just faculty, teaching faculty, but anybody who touches a computer, which nowadays is probably everybody that's employed in a district, but it also includes your parents too. A lot of this legislation was born out of parent concerns over what they perceive as potential misuse of student data. In some cases, that misuse was actually happening. In some cases, it's just fear. A lot of the legislative outreach during this time when we were trying in the rooms and stuff, trying to negotiate this part, this parent group basically was launching all sorts of social media stuff about how districts are at schools and companies are misusing student data. And a lot of it was hype. A lot of it was, yeah, it's not entirely true, but hey, message was effective because the witness slips that came in, and then actually they do pay attention to those things, the legislators. There were 100 or so people that were against the law. They wanted, not really against the law, but wanted changes, but there were 5 times as many people for it. And all these are parents too. They're listening who they are. Well, parents are voters. 5 to 1 for. If I'm a legislator and I'm running for election, okay, I'll sign on. So they do pay attention to those things. That's what ended up happening. So education on the parent part, I think, is going to be a crucial piece too. Let them know why this is. But also, we're all of a sudden start talking about this, and we haven't done before. One of the things you're going to have to also reassure them: this is not a problem. Nothing happened. This is proactive, but this is why we're doing this. To let everyone know, but not because there's some big issue or like we were hacked. No. But keep that in mind. You might get some people that are like, wait a minute, why are we talking about this all of a sudden? Okay, any questions? Like I said, I apologize. I know you guys have a lot more questions than I can really answer. You know, like I said, we're early in the process. We are getting a team together to start deep diving this in the agency. We need to figure out, you know, what kind of guidance we look, you know, what some of these implementation questions you guys have asked, what that means, or how to provide guidance for that. Our own practices obviously need to change, like sending clear text passwords for iOS password resets. Probably not a good idea. You know, so there are even some internal procedures that we need to obviously change in light of this law. We should have probably done that anyway, but obviously we definitely need to now. So again, there'll be more sessions. We're working with a lot of partners and stuff. I know, you know, IDEA definitely a partner in this. We also have the ISBE folks here that will also be helping with this. So we are definitely involved in this. Hopefully have some of you guys. Yes.
So I'm not the best note taker. Would I be able to get a copy of this PowerPoint?
Yes, we're gonna give it all to Amber. You'll get both my PowerPoint as well as Jeff's PowerPoint. So yeah, we'll get it out there. No problem.
So who's in charge of enforcement?
Were there any other questions online? I don't want to forget about you folks too.
Who's in charge of enforcement?
No questions? Okay. I'm sorry?
So who's in charge of enforcement? Who's doing the policing?
You know, that's a really good question. Question was, what about enforcement? So, yes. But you know, interesting enough, there were actually specific things in the legislation, the original form, that spelled out specific penalties for noncompliance. Those were taken out. So in some cases, you look at the law like, well, this doesn't really mention like what happens if we don't do this. Yes, but the Attorney General Office is charged with enforcement of this. Probably not a good idea to go up against the Attorney General's office for just general matters, right? But as far as non-compliance, there is no specific provisions. Like there's no private right of action, but you know, in not doing this, could you open yourself up to other types of liabilities? Probably. Again, not a lawyer, but you know, I think that if a law is passed and you don't do it, and then something happens because you are not complying with the law, you're opening yourself up to liability. But you may not be wanting to do that. So again,
yeah, nobody wants that. I just
right.
Curious.
All right, let's give Eric a round of applause. It's not always, right, I was going to say, it's not always easy being in a room full of people when you're from ISBE trying to answer questions that you don't necessarily have to answer for.
We're also going to have two, just real quick, Amber, sorry. Also have a number of resources and links to them things. So some of the stuff I had earlier, there were links that you can click on this news articles. List of just the website for the law, the Records Act, FERPA. Some of these are really good resources like FERPA, Sherpa. So if you want to understand what this is a really good site. But also some of these sites also contain some specific things you can do to kind of understand the problem and kind of take a look at your own cybersecurity posture and kind of assess where you're at currently, what you might need to do. NIST is on here, COSIN, so some good stuff there. Also, these guys are pretty good too. But this site here, if you don't know what it is, there's a guy by the name of Doug Levin who has been basically mapping out for the past 3 or 4 years every cybersecurity incident that's affected a school that's reported to the media. And there's dozens of hundreds actually of pins on this Google map of the United States, including dozens in Illinois. So earlier when I said that, you know, a lot of this is getting out to the media and being reported, a lot of that's coming from this. And so you want to see what's going on and where we're at and how prevalent it is, go here. And again, we'll provide those both slides, not only mine, but just to Amber, and I'll get it out to you guys. So.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
All right, so final couple of things here. One, if anyone needs professional development, free professional development hours for attending today for licensure, if you have an educational certificate, is there anybody in the room that needs that? Okay, I will send the bit.ly out. So we can provide those for you today for 3 hours. In addition, if you did sign the paper out there, we have checked you in. Lindsay's also collecting email addresses to those that are online. And we are going to do a random drawing of those that checked in or that we have the email from for a day at our conference.
that if you want to use that for that Thursday or any of the days, that would be great. But someone online live or that was in the room today will get a conference comp for IdeaCon at the end of February. So if you didn't sign that, please make sure that you do, because I do have about 7 or 8 people that didn't get checked in, okay? In the meantime, if there are other things like this, or Google, Microsoft, Apple, they're all people, groups that we work with, other organizations. If there is something very specific and targeted that you need as individuals in your role for professional development, again, please reach out to Lindsay or I, and we will continue to have things like this. And we do like to offer them at no cost as much as possible, sometimes low cost, but we want to meet your needs. So if you have something that you want to do as a group or at your district, please get a hold of us and let us know. So again, thanks so much for being here. We'll be around if anybody has any questions. There is some idea swag in the back. If you'd like to grab some of that, feel free. And good luck with all of this, and we'll continue to follow up in an email with additional information by Friday at the latest. Okay? Thank you so much. Have a safe trip back. Thank you. Very good. Very, oh,
Yeah, I'll send you a little email before.